The baby's scream tore through the Montana darkness like a knife through silk. Caleb Hartman stood in the center of his dying ranch, the newborn thrashing in his arms, and he realized with cold terror that he had no idea how to keep her alive. 1 week. That's how long his wife had been in the ground. 1 week since he'd become both father and mother to a child who wouldn't stop crying, wouldn't eat, wouldn't sleep. When the matchmaker's buggy rolled up his drive at dawn, he wanted to send her straight to hell. Instead, she looked at him with sharp eyes and said 5 words that split his world open. I told you you needed a wife. Before we begin, if you're drawn to stories of survival, second chances, and love built from ashes, stay with me until the very end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The ranch house smelled like death and sour milk. Caleb Hartman stood at the kitchen window, watching the sun bleed orange across the Montana horizon, and tried to remember the last time he'd slept. 2 days? 3? The baby, his daughter, though he could barely bring himself to think of her that way, lay in a wooden cradle his own father had built, whimpering softly. The sound was worse than screaming. It meant she was giving up. He'd tried everything. The goat's milk made her sick. The sugar water passed right through her. Mrs. Chen from the neighboring ranch had come by with some kind of rice concoction that the baby had refused entirely, her tiny face twisting in disgust before she'd vomited it back up. Caleb had thanked the woman, closed the door, and slid down against it until he was sitting on the floor, the baby in his lap, both of them crying. That was yesterday, or maybe the day before. Time had stopped meaning anything. The house still held traces of Sarah everywhere, her apron hanging on its hook, her hairbrush on the dresser upstairs, the half-finished quilt she'd been sewing, folded neatly in the chest at the foot of their bed. Their bed. Except it wasn't theirs anymore. It was just his, cold and vast and empty, and he couldn't bring himself to sleep in it. He'd been dozing in the chair beside the baby's cradle, jerking awake every time she made a sound, terrified that each breath might be her last. The morning Sarah died, she'd gripped his hand so hard her nails drew blood. Promise me, she'd whispered, her voice barely audible over the midwife's urgent movements. Promise me you'll take care of her. He'd promised. He'd have promised her anything, but he had no idea how to keep that promise. Caleb ran a hand over his face, feeling the rough stubble that had grown into nearly a full beard. He couldn't remember the last time he'd shaved, or eaten a full meal, or changed his shirt. The ranch was falling apart around him. The chickens weren't being fed properly. The vegetable garden Sarah had tended so carefully was beginning to wilt. He'd managed to keep the horses and cattle alive, but barely. Everything else was sliding into chaos. He heard the baby's breathing change, a small hitch that made his heart stop, and he was across the room in 3 strides, leaning over the cradle. She was still breathing, still Ov. Her tiny fists were clenched, her face scrunched up in an expression that looked almost angry. She was so small, so impossibly, terrifyingly small. I don't know what to do, he whispered to her. I don't know how to do this without her. The baby didn't answer. She just kept breathing, in and out, each breath a small miracle and a fresh terror. That's when he heard the buggy. At first, he thought he was imagining it. Nobody came out this far unless they had specific business, and everyone in Willow Bend knew what had happened. They'd come for the funeral, dozens of them, filling his house with casseroles and sympathy and uncomfortable silences, but since then they'd left him alone. Probably figured he needed time to grieve. Probably had no idea he was drowning. But the sound of wheels on the dirt road was unmistakable, growing louder as it approached. Caleb straightened, glancing down at himself. He looked like hell, and he knew it. Wrinkled shirt, unbuttoned vest, trousers he'd been wearing for days. His hair was standing up in every direction, and his eyes felt like they'd been rubbed with sand. He didn't care. Let whoever it was see him falling apart. Let them see that he couldn't handle this. Maybe they'd take the baby somewhere safe, somewhere with a woman who actually knew what she was doing. The thought made something twist painfully in his chest, but he shoved it down. The buggy came to a stop outside, and Caleb heard the creak of someone climbing down. Footsteps on the porch, then a sharp, authoritative knock that made the baby startle in her cradle. He opened the door, ready to tell whoever it was to leave. The woman standing on his porch was not what he expected. She was older, somewhere in her 50s, he guessed, with iron gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that seemed to catalog everything about him in a single glance. She wore a dark traveling dress and carried a large carpet bag, and there was something about the set of her jaw that suggested she was not a woman who accepted no for an answer. "Mr. Hartman," she said crisply, "I'm Eleanor Price. I believe we've corresponded." Caleb stared at her. Corresponded. He hadn't corresponded with anyone except the feed supplier and the bank, and both of those had been Sarah's domain before. Oh God, the matchmaker. "You," he said slowly, his exhausted brain trying to catch up. "You're the woman Sarah wrote to." "I am." Eleanor Price's sharp eyes moved past him, taking in the chaos of the house behind him. "May I come in?" "No." Her eyebrows rose slightly. "No?" "I don't need a matchmaker, Mrs. Price. My wife—" His voice caught. He forced himself to continue. "My wife is dead. I'm not looking to replace her." "I can see that." Eleanor's tone was matter-of-fact rather than sympathetic, which somehow made it worse. "What I can also see is that you're about to collapse. Your house is falling apart, and unless I'm very much mistaken, that baby I hear crying in there hasn't been properly cared for in days." Heat flooded Caleb's face. "You don't know anything about—" "I know exactly what I'm looking at, Mr. Hartman. I've been doing this work for 23 years. I've seen men in your position before." She adjusted her grip on her carpet bag. "Now, your wife wrote to me 3 months before she died. She was worried about you. She wanted to make sure that if anything happened to her, you would have help. She paid me in advance to come here and assist you in finding a suitable wife." "I don't want a wife. What you want and what you need are two different things." Eleanor's gaze moved past him again, toward the sound of the baby's increasingly desperate cries. "When was the last time that child was fed?" Caleb's jaw clenched. "This morning." "And did she keep it down?" He didn't answer. He didn't have to. Eleanor sighed, and for the first time her expression softened slightly. "Mr. Hartman, I'm not here to force you into anything, but I am here because your wife, a woman who clearly loved you very much, asked me to help. And right now, whether you like it or not, you need help." She paused. "Are you going to let me in, or are you going to let that baby cry herself sick while you try to prove you can handle this alone?" The words hit like a physical blow. Caleb felt something crack inside him. Pride, maybe, or the last of his stubborn resistance. He looked at Eleanor Price, at her stern face and uncompromising eyes, and felt the fight drain out of him. He stepped aside. Eleanor swept past him into the house, setting her carpetbag down with practiced efficiency. Her gaze moved around the room, taking in the unwashed dishes stacked in the sink, the cold fireplace, the general air of neglect that had settled over everything. But she didn't comment on any of it. Instead, she walked straight to the cradle where the baby was working herself into a full-blown wail. "How old?" Eleanor asked, not looking at him. 8 days. "And her name?" Caleb's throat tightened. "She doesn't have one yet." Eleanor's hand stilled on the edge of the cradle. She turned to look at him, and for a moment something flickered in her expression. Understanding, maybe, or pity. "You haven't named her. I can't—" The word stuck. He tried again. "Sarah was supposed to name her. We were going to decide together, after she was born, but she never—" He couldn't finish. Eleanor held his gaze for a long moment. Then she turned back to the baby and, with surprising gentleness, lifted her from the cradle. The baby's cries intensified immediately, her tiny body rigid with distress. "Have you tried different feeding positions?" Eleanor asked, cradling the infant against her shoulder. "Everything. She won't eat, or she eats and then she's sick." "And you've tried goat's milk?" "Yes." "Watered down, with a little sugar?" "Yes." Eleanor hummed thoughtfully, swaying slightly with the baby. "What about the way you're holding her? Infants can sense tension. If you're anxious, she'll be anxious." Caleb almost laughed, but it came out bitter. "I'm holding a week-old baby whose mother is dead. How exactly am I supposed to not be anxious?" "By accepting that you can't do this alone." Eleanor's voice was firm, but not unkind. She turned to face him fully, the baby still crying in her arms. "Mr. Hartman, I'm going to be blunt with you. You're running on no sleep, no proper food, and more grief than any man should have to carry by himself. That baby can feel all of it. She's picking up on your fear, your exhaustion, your loss, and until you get yourself in order, she's not going to settle. So what am I supposed to do? The question came out harsh, almost angry. Just stop grieving? Pretend everything's fine? No. Eleanor's expression softened. You're supposed to let someone help you. That's what your wife wanted. That's why she contacted me. Caleb wanted to argue. Wanted to tell this stranger to leave his house and take her judgment and her carpet bag and her offers of help with her. But the baby was still crying, that desperate, heartbroken sound that made his chest feel like it was being crushed, and he was so tired. So unbearably, crushingly tired. I don't need a wife, he said finally, the words coming out defeated. I just need someone who knows what they're doing with a baby. Eleanor studied him for a long moment. Then she nodded. All right, then let me stay for a few days. Not as a matchmaker, just as someone who knows her way around an infant and a household. No strings attached. If you want me to leave after that, I'll go. Caleb looked at her, at this stern, practical woman who had appeared on his doorstep like some kind of uninvited salvation, and felt the last of his resistance crumble. Fine, he said. A few days. Eleanor nodded briskly. Good. Now, where's your kitchen? This baby needs to eat, and you need to sit down before you fall down. The kitchen, as it turned out, was even worse than the main room. Eleanor took one look at the pile of unwashed dishes, the spoiled food, and the general disarray, and set the baby, still crying, back in her cradle with a firm, "She'll survive another few minutes." Then she rolled up her sleeves and got to work. Caleb sat at the kitchen table because she'd ordered him to, and he was too exhausted to argue. He watched her move around his kitchen with the kind of efficient competence that made him feel even more useless than he already did. She found the kettle, filled it with water from the pump, set it on the stove. She cleared space on the counter, located a clean bowl and spoon, examined the contents of his pantry with a critical eye. "When did you last eat?" she asked without turning around. "I don't know. Yesterday?" "What did you have?" "Bread, I think. Just bread." "I wasn't hungry." Eleanor made a sound that might have been disapproval or exasperation or both. "Mr. Hartman, you cannot take care of an infant if you're starving yourself. Grief is not an excuse to neglect your health." "I'm not—" He stopped because he was. He knew he was. "I just forget." "Then I'll remind you." She pulled out a basket of eggs, examined them, selected 3. "You have chickens, I see. Are they laying well?" "Well enough." "And the garden?" "I saw it from the road. It needs water." "I know." "The fence by the barn is listing, and there's a broken window on the second floor." Caleb's jaw tightened. "I know." Eleanor cracked the eggs into the bowl, whisking them with short, efficient strokes. "I'm not criticizing, Mr. Hartman. I'm taking inventory. A ranch doesn't run itself, and you can't do everything alone. That's simply a fact." "Sarah managed just fine." The words came out before he could stop them, sharp with grief and anger. Eleanor paused in her whisking, but she didn't turn around. "Your wife," she said carefully, "was not doing this alone. She had you. You worked together." She resumed whisking. "Now you're trying to do the work of 2 people plus care for a newborn, all while grieving the loss of your partner. It's not sustainable." Caleb wanted to argue, but he couldn't. Everything she was saying was true. The ranch was falling apart. He was falling apart. And the baby. The baby's cries had intensified to full-blown screams. Eleanor immediately set down the bowl and moved back to the cradle. She lifted the infant with practiced hands, checking her, diaper wet, no surprise there, and carried her to the kitchen table. "I'll need clean cloths," she said to Caleb, "and water. Warm, if you have it." He did as she asked, moving like a man in a dream. By the time he returned with the basin of warm water and a stack of clean cloths, Eleanor had the baby laid out on the table, murmuring to her in a low, soothing voice that seemed to cut through the crying, if only a little. "There now," Eleanor said softly. "I know, sweetheart. I know. Everything's frightening right now, isn't it? But we're going to take care of you. That's what we're going to do." Caleb watched her change the baby's diaper with quick, efficient movements, talking the whole time in that same calm, steady voice. The baby's cries decreased to whimpers. By the time Eleanor had her cleaned and wrapped in a fresh cloth, she'd stopped crying entirely. Her dark eyes, Sarah's eyes, staring up at the stranger with an expression that might have been confusion or relief or both. "See?" Eleanor said, lifting the baby against her shoulder. "All better. Sometimes all we need is someone to notice what's wrong and fix it." She turned to Caleb. "Now, let's try feeding her again. But this time, we're going to do it properly." It took an hour of Eleanor patiently trying different things, different positions, different ways of getting the baby to latch onto the bottle, different mixtures of milk and water and sugar. The baby fought it at first, turning her head away, crying, pushing at the bottle with her tiny fists. But Eleanor was patient in a way Caleb had never been, never pausing in her gentle murmuring, never showing frustration or fear. And finally, the baby drank. Not much, just a few swallows. But it was something. She kept it down. And when Eleanor burped her afterward, with more efficiency than Caleb had managed in 8 days, the baby didn't vomit. "There," Eleanor said, cradling the infant against her chest. "That's progress." Caleb felt something loosen in his chest, relief so profound it made him lightheaded. "She ate." "She did." Eleanor smiled down at the baby, and for the first time since she'd arrived, her stern expression softened into something almost gentle. She just needed someone who knew what they were doing. Babies can sense desperation. It makes them resistant. "I wasn't desperate," Caleb said, but it was a lie, and they both knew it. Eleanor looked at him. "Mr. Hartman, you're drowning. Anyone can see that. There's no shame in admitting you need help. I told you, I don't need a wife. I'm not talking about a wife." Eleanor's voice was sharp again. "I'm talking about help. Any kind of help. A housekeeper. A cook. A wet nurse. Someone to share the burden so you don't collapse under the weight of it." Caleb opened his mouth to argue, but the baby made a small sound, not quite a cry, more like a sleepy murmur, and both of them fell silent. Eleanor swayed gently, patting the baby's back, and after a moment, the infant's eyes drifted closed. "She's sleeping," Caleb said, as if he couldn't quite believe it. "She is." Eleanor moved to the cradle and laid the baby down with infinite care. The infant stirred but didn't wake, her tiny chest rising and falling in the steady rhythm of sleep. Eleanor straightened, pulling a light blanket over the baby, and turned to Caleb. "When was the last time she slept for more than an hour?" "I don't know. Days, maybe." "Then we have a window, and you're going to use it to eat, bathe, and rest." "I can't." "You can, and you will." Eleanor pointed at the eggs she'd been preparing earlier. "Sit, eat. I'm going to heat water for a bath, and you're going to use it. Then you're going to sleep in an actual bed for at least 4 hours. I'll watch the baby. She'll wake up, and I'll feed her. I've managed to do it once. I can do it again." Eleanor crossed her arms, her expression brooking no argument. "Mr. Hartman, you're no good to that child if you're dead on your feet. Now sit down and eat before I force feed you myself." Despite everything, the grief, the exhaustion, the bone-deep fear, Caleb felt something almost like a smile tug at his mouth. "You're very bossy, Mrs. Price." "I prefer effective." She gestured at the table. "Eat." He ate. The eggs were good, better than anything he'd managed to cook in the past week, and he was hungrier than he'd realized. He finished them in minutes, then ate the bread she put in front of him and drank the tea she'd made. By the time he was done, he felt almost human again. Almost. Eleanor was as good as her word about the bath. She heated water, filled the tub in the small washroom off the kitchen, and pointed at it with an expression that suggested he'd better use it or face consequences. Caleb was too tired to argue. He stripped off his filthy clothes, sank into the hot water, and felt muscles he hadn't known were clenched begin to loosen. He stayed in the bath until the water began to cool, washing away days of sweat and grime and grief. When he finally emerged, wrapped in a clean towel with his hair dripping, he found Eleanor in the main room, sitting in the chair beside the cradle with some mending in her lap. She looked up as he entered, took in his clean state, and nodded approvingly. "Better? Now go upstairs and sleep. I'll wake you if she needs you." Caleb wanted to argue. Wanted to say he couldn't possibly sleep, not when the baby might wake, not when there were 1,000 things that needed doing, but his body was making the decision for him. He was so tired he could barely stand. "Just a few hours," he said. "4 at minimum." Eleanor's tone left no room for negotiation. "Go." He went. The bed, their bed, felt enormous and cold. Caleb lay down on his side, on what had been his side, carefully not looking at the empty space beside him. Sarah's pillow still smelled like her. He turned his face into it and felt something break open in his chest. He'd been holding it together for 8 days, holding himself rigid because if he let go, if he let himself feel it, he'd shatter. But now with Eleanor downstairs watching the baby, with the knowledge that someone else was there, someone competent and capable, he finally let himself fall apart. The grief came in waves. Not tears, he was too exhausted for tears, but a deep, wrenching ache that seemed to hollow him out from the inside. Sarah was gone. His wife, his partner, the woman who'd made this ranch a home instead of just a piece of land, gone. And in her place was this tiny, terrifying person who needed him in ways he didn't know how to provide. He'd failed her. Failed both of them. Failed as a husband by not being able to save Sarah. Failed as a father by not knowing how to keep their daughter alive. The thoughts spiraled darker and darker until exhaustion finally pulled him under. He dreamed of Sarah. Dreamed she was beside him in the bed, her hand in his, telling him everything would be all right. Dreamed he could turn to her and she'd still be there. Solid and real and alive. But when he reached for her, she dissolved into mist, and he woke with a gasp to find the bed empty and the room dark. For a moment he couldn't remember where he was, or why. Then it all came rushing back. Eleanor, the baby, the bath, the bed. How long had he slept? He sat up, his heart pounding. The house was quiet. Too quiet. The baby should be crying by now. She was always crying, unless... He was out of bed and down the stairs before he'd fully registered the decision to move, taking the steps 2 at a time in the darkness. He burst into the main room, his heart in his throat, expecting... Eleanor was still sitting in the chair beside the cradle. The baby was in her arms, awake but quiet, staring up at the older woman with those dark, serious eyes. And Eleanor was talking to her. Not baby talk, not nonsense sounds, but a real story, told in a low, steady voice. And so the little fox said to the bear, "I may be small, but I'm clever, and clever beats big any day." The bear didn't believe her, of course. Bears never do. But the fox had a plan. Caleb stood frozen in the doorway, watching as Eleanor told the story to his daughter. The baby wasn't crying. She wasn't even fussing. She was just listening. Her tiny face was turned toward Eleanor, completely focused, as if she understood every word. Eleanor must have sensed his presence because she looked up, her finger pressed to her lips in a silent gesture for quiet. Caleb nodded and moved closer, careful not to make noise. "What are you doing?" he whispered. "Telling her a story." Eleanor's voice was barely audible. "My grandmother used to tell it to me. Children like stories, even very small children. She's 8 days old. She still likes the sound of a voice. It comforts her." Eleanor looked back down at the baby. "And she needs comfort right now. Her whole world has been turned upside down. She was supposed to have a mother. Now all she has is a father who doesn't know what he's doing and a stranger who appeared out of nowhere." The words stung, but they were true. Caleb sank onto the edge of the nearest chair, watching Eleanor continue her story. The baby's eyes were starting to droop now, her tiny fists unclenching. "How long have you been doing this?" he asked quietly. 2 hours. She woke up hungry, so I fed her. Then she wouldn't settle, so I tried this. It seems to work. 2 hours. Caleb felt guilt wash over him. "You should have woken me." "Why? So you could be exhausted again?" "No." Eleanor shifted the baby slightly. "You needed the rest, and I managed fine." "How did you know what to do?" Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then, still looking at the baby, she said, "I had a daughter once, a long time ago." Caleb felt something twist in his chest. The way she said it had made it clear the girl was gone. "I'm sorry." So am I. Eleanor's voice was soft. She'd be about 40 now if she'd lived. Cholera took her when she was 3. Took my husband too. That's when I started doing this work. She glanced up at him. Matchmaking. Helping people find what they've lost. But you can't bring them back. No. Eleanor's expression was sad but clear-eyed. No, you can't bring them back, but you can build something new, not a replacement. Just something new. The baby was asleep now, her breathing deep and even. Eleanor stood carefully and laid her in the cradle, tucking the blanket around her with practiced hands. Then she turned to Caleb. It's late, she said, or early, depending on how you look at it. You should go back to bed. What about you? I'll rest here. I'm used to keeping watch. She settled back into the chair. Go on, Mr. Hartman. She'll be fine. Caleb wanted to argue. Wanted to say he should be the one watching the baby, that it was his responsibility, his duty. But the truth was, he didn't want to. The relief of having someone else there, someone who knew what she was doing, was so profound it made him feel guilty. Thank you, he said quietly. Eleanor nodded. You're welcome. Now go, before she wakes again. He went. But this time, when he lay down in the empty bed, he fell asleep almost immediately, and he didn't dream at all. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Caleb woke to the sound of someone moving around downstairs, and for just a moment thought it was Sarah. Then reality crashed back and he remembered. Eleanor. The matchmaker who wasn't supposed to be here, who he'd agreed to let stay for a few days, who had somehow managed to do in one night what he'd been failing at for more than a week. He dressed quickly and went downstairs. Eleanor was in the kitchen, and the transformation was startling. The dishes had been washed, the floor had been swept. Something was cooking on the stove that smelled like bread and butter and salt, and for the first time in 8 days, the house felt almost normal. The baby was in her cradle, awake, but not crying, making small sounds that seemed curious rather than distressed. Eleanor was bustling around the kitchen with the kind of efficient energy that suggested she'd been up for hours. Good morning, she said without turning around. There's coffee on the stove. Help yourself. Caleb poured himself a cup, his hands still clumsy with sleep. How long have you been up? Since dawn. The baby woke at first light, so I fed her and then started on the house. There's porridge if you're hungry. He was hungry, ravenously so. He sat at the table and ate the porridge she put in front of him, thick and hot and better than anything he'd managed to make himself, while Eleanor continued working. She moved through the space like she'd lived there for years, knowing exactly where everything was, what needed doing. It should have felt invasive. This was his house, his and Sarah's, and this stranger was rearranging it to suit herself. But instead, it just felt easier, like someone had lifted a weight he hadn't known he was carrying. You didn't have to do all this, he said finally. I know. Eleanor wiped her hands on a cloth. But it needed doing, and you weren't going to do it. That's not... He stopped because it was true. He wasn't going to do it, not anytime soon. I would have gotten to it eventually. Eventually the baby would starve or the house would collapse or both. Eleanor's tone was matter-of-fact rather than cruel. Mr. Hartman, I'm not trying to shame you. I'm just pointing out reality. Caleb set down his spoon. Why are you here, Mrs. Price? Really? Eleanor turned to face him, leaning against the counter. Because your wife asked me to be. My wife is dead. I'm aware. That doesn't change the promise I made to her. She crossed her arms. Sarah wrote to me 3 months ago. She was very clear about what she wanted. She said if anything happened to her, you'd need help. Not because you're incompetent, but because this ranch is too much for one person and you'd never ask for assistance even if you were drowning. She said that? In almost those exact words. Eleanor's expression softened slightly. She loved you very much, Mr. Hartman. She wanted to make sure you'd be taken care of. Caleb felt his throat tighten. She shouldn't have. I don't need taking care of. Everyone needs taking care of sometimes. There's no shame in that. He wanted to argue, but the baby made a sound, not quite a cry, just a small, questioning noise, and Eleanor moved immediately to the cradle. She lifted the infant out, checked her diaper, and began that same gentle swaying motion she'd used the night before. "She'll need feeding soon," Eleanor said. "Would you like to try?" Every instinct in Caleb's body screamed no. He'd tried feeding her dozens of times, and every time had been a disaster. But Eleanor was looking at him with an expression that suggested this wasn't really a question, and he found himself standing, crossing to where she stood. "What do I do?" he asked. "First, relax." Eleanor transferred the baby to his arms, adjusting his hold until the infant was cradled properly against his chest. "She can feel your tension. If you're anxious, she'll be anxious. Breathe." Caleb breathed. The baby squirmed against him, her face scrunching up in a way that usually preceded screaming. But before she could start, Eleanor pressed a bottle into his hand, already prepared, already warmed. "Now, support her head. Bring the bottle to her lips. Don't force it. Let her decide." He did as instructed, his hands shaking slightly. The baby turned her head away at first, pushing at the bottle with her tiny fists, but Eleanor's hand came down on his shoulder, steadying him. "Patience," she murmured. "Try again, gently." He tried again. This time, the baby's mouth opened slightly. The nipple touched her lips, and, impossibly, miraculously, she latched on. Caleb held his breath as the baby began to drink, her small body relaxing against him. She drank slowly, carefully, but she drank. When she was done, Eleanor showed him how to burp her properly, and when the baby let out a small, satisfied sound, Caleb felt something in his chest crack open. "I did it," he said, his voice rough. "You did." Eleanor was smiling. "See? You just needed someone to show you how." The baby's eyes were drifting closed now, her tiny face peaceful in a way Caleb hadn't seen since Sarah had been alive to hold her. He looked down at his daughter, really looked at her for the first time in days, and felt the grief surge up again, overwhelming and crushing. "I don't know how to do this," he whispered. Eleanor's hand was still on his shoulder. She squeezed gently. "Then let me teach you." And for the first time since Sarah had died, Caleb allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to do this alone. The rest of the day passed in a strange, almost dreamlike blur. Eleanor moved through the house like a force of nature, tackling tasks with ruthless efficiency while somehow still managing to care for the baby. She showed Caleb how to properly mix the formula, how to hold the bottle at the right angle, how to recognize when the baby was hungry versus when she just needed comfort. She cooked meals, real meals, not just bread and whatever else was lying around, and made him sit down and eat them. She took inventory of the garden, the livestock, the state of the barn. She made lists of what needed fixing, what needed buying, what could wait. And through it all, she kept talking to the baby. Stories, mostly. Little tales about foxes and bears and clever rabbits who outwitted wolves. The baby seemed fascinated by Eleanor's voice, her dark eyes tracking the older woman's movements whenever she was near. By evening, Caleb was exhausted in a different way than he'd been before. Not the desperate, terrified exhaustion of trying and failing to keep his daughter alive, but the bone-deep tiredness of actually working again, of feeling useful, of being part of something that wasn't just survival. They sat together in the main room as the sun set, the baby sleeping peacefully in her cradle between them. Eleanor was mending one of Caleb's shirts. He hadn't even asked her to do it. She'd just found the pile of torn clothing and started working, and he was watching the dying light paint the Montana hills gold. "Your wife was right about this place," Eleanor said quietly. "It's beautiful." "It is," Caleb agreed. "She loved it here." "Did you come here together?" "No, I was here first. Won the land in a poker game, if you can believe that." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Sarah thought I was crazy when I told her. Who wins a ranch in poker? But she came out anyway, took one look at the hills and the sky, and said it was the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen. "How did you meet her?" Caleb was quiet for a moment, remembering. "She was a school teacher, came to Willow Bend to work at the new school they'd built. I went to town for supplies one day and saw her standing outside the general store with her arms full of books. She'd dropped one and was trying to pick it up without dropping the rest. I helped her. And fell in love?" "Not immediately." He smiled despite himself. "She thought I was rude." I'd made some comment about women and heavy books, trying to be funny. It didn't land. She told me she could carry her own books just fine, thank you, and marched off with her nose in the air. He paused, but I kept finding excuses to go to town after that, and eventually she stopped glaring at me long enough to have a conversation. She sounds like she was quite a woman. She was. Then the smile faded. She was everything. Eleanor set down her mending. Mr. Hartman, I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to really think about your answer before you speak. Caleb looked at her warily. All right. Why haven't you named the baby? The question hit like a punch to the gut. Caleb's hands clenched on the arms of his chair. I told you, Sarah and I were going to choose together. But Sarah's gone, and that baby needs a name, needs an identity beyond just the baby. Eleanor's gaze was steady. What are you really afraid of? I'm not afraid. You're terrified. Her voice was gentle but implacable. And I understand why. Naming her makes it real, makes her yours in a way she wasn't before. And you're afraid that if you let yourself love her fully, you'll lose her the way you lost Sarah. Caleb stood abruptly, unable to sit still under that penetrating gaze. You don't know what you're talking about, don't I? Eleanor stood as well, facing him across the room. Mr. Hartman, I've been where you are. I've lost someone I loved more than life itself, and I know what it's like to be so afraid of feeling that pain again that you hold yourself back from anyone who might make you vulnerable. This is different. It's not. Eleanor's voice was firm. You're keeping that baby at arm's length because you're afraid, but she's not going anywhere. She's yours, whether you name her or not, whether you let yourself love her or not. And every day you hold back is a day you're wasting. She might die. The words burst out of him before he could stop them, raw and desperate. She's so small, Mrs. Price, so fragile. What if I can't keep her alive? What if I fail her the way I failed Sarah? You didn't fail Sarah. Eleanor's expression softened. Women die in childbirth, Mr. Hartman. It's a tragedy, but it's not your fault, and you're not going to fail this baby. Not if you let people help you. I don't want help. I want... His voice broke. I want my wife back. I know. Eleanor moved closer, and for a moment, Caleb thought she might touch him, put a hand on his arm, something, but she didn't. She just stood there, steady and solid, and said, I know you do, but you can't have her back. What you can have is a future with your daughter, a real future, not just survival. But you have to choose it. Caleb looked at her, this sharp-tongued, bossy woman who had appeared in his life like some kind of avenging angel, and felt something shift inside him. She was right. She was right, and he hated it, and he was grateful for it all at once. I don't know how, he said finally, the words barely audible. Then let me show you. Eleanor's voice was gentle. Let me stay. Not forever. Just long enough to help you get on your feet, to teach you what you need to know, to help you find someone permanent if that's what you decide you want. I told you I don't want a wife. I heard you the first time. Eleanor smiled slightly. But you do need help, and I'm offering it. No conditions, no obligations, just help. Caleb looked at the baby sleeping in her cradle, at her tiny perfect face that was so much like Sarah's, it hurt to look at her. Then he looked at Eleanor, at her steady knowing eyes, and made a decision. A few more days, he said. That's all. Eleanor nodded. A few more days. But both of them knew it was a lie. A few days wouldn't be enough. Nothing would be enough except time and help and the slow, painful process of learning to live again. The baby stirred in her cradle, making a small sound. Eleanor moved immediately, but Caleb was faster. He crossed to the cradle and lifted his daughter carefully, cradling her against his chest the way Eleanor had taught him. It's all right, he murmured, swaying slightly. I've got you. The baby's eyes opened, dark and solemn. She looked up at him, and for just a moment, Caleb could have sworn he saw Sarah in those eyes. Not her coloring, the baby's eyes were too dark for that, but something else, something essential. I'll keep you safe, he whispered to his daughter. I promise. And this time, he meant it. Eleanor watched from across the room, her expression unreadable. Then she picked up her mending again and said, I think that's enough for today. Why don't you try putting her down again? I'll make us some supper. Caleb did as she suggested, laying the baby back in her cradle. She fussed for a moment but settled quickly, her eyes drifting closed. And as Caleb stood there looking down at his daughter, he felt the grief begin to shift, not disappear, but transform into something he could maybe, eventually, learn to carry. The road ahead was still long, still frightening, but with Eleanor there, with her sharp tongue and her gentle hands and her stories about clever foxes, it felt a little less impossible. A few more days, he'd said. He had a feeling it was going to be much longer than that. The few days turned into a week, and the week stretched toward 2. Eleanor stayed, and with each passing day, the house transformed a little more. The dishes were always clean now, the floors were swept, the garden got its water, and the fence by the barn got its repair. The chickens were fed on schedule, and the cattle no longer bellowed their complaints at dawn. It was as if Eleanor had taken the chaos of Caleb's life and simply reorganized it into something manageable. But it wasn't just the house that was changing. The baby was thriving in a way she hadn't before. She was eating regularly now, keeping her food down, sleeping in longer stretches. Her cries, when they came, were less desperate and more communicative. Hunger, discomfort, the simple need to be held. Eleanor seemed to understand each one instinctively, responding with the kind of calm competence that made Caleb feel both grateful and inadequate in equal measure. He was learning, though, slowly, painfully, but learning. Eleanor made him practice everything: feeding, changing, burping, soothing. She stood beside him while he fumbled through each task, her voice patient but firm, correcting his grip on the bottle or the angle of his arm or the rhythm of his swaying. And gradually, impossibly, he began to get better at it. The baby still cried when he held her sometimes, but not always. Sometimes she would settle against his chest and simply exist there, her tiny body warm and solid and real. In those moments, Caleb felt something he hadn't felt since Sarah died, a fragile, terrifying hope that maybe he could actually do this. It was during one of these quiet moments, late in the second week, that the first woman arrived. Caleb was sitting in the rocking chair by the window, the baby dozing against his shoulder, when he heard the sound of a wagon approaching. He looked up to see Eleanor moving to the door, her expression suddenly alert in a way that made his stomach tighten. "Who is that?" he asked. Eleanor glanced back at him, and something flickered in her expression. Guilt, maybe, or apprehension. "That would be Miss Rebecca Foster. I sent word to her last week." Caleb felt ice flood his veins. "You did what?" "I sent word to several women, actually, potential matches." Eleanor's voice was calm, but she didn't quite meet his eyes. "That's what your wife hired me to do, Mr. Hartman. Find you a suitable wife." "I told you I didn't want—" "You told me you didn't need a wife. But we both know that's not true." Eleanor opened the door before he could respond. "Miss Foster comes highly recommended. She's worked as a governess for 3 families, has experience with infants, and she's looking to settle down. I think you'll find her very suitable." Caleb wanted to argue, wanted to tell Eleanor to send the woman away immediately. But the baby was sleeping, and he didn't want to wake her with raised voices. So he sat there, trapped in the rocking chair, and watched as a young woman climbed down from the wagon and approached the house. Rebecca Foster was perhaps 25, with light brown hair and a pleasant face. She wore a traveling dress that had seen better days but was clean and well-maintained, and she carried herself with the kind of careful dignity that suggested someone who was used to being evaluated. When Eleanor introduced her to Caleb, she curtsied slightly and smiled. "Mr. Hartman," she said, "it's a pleasure to meet you. Mrs. Price has told me so much about your situation." "Has she?" Caleb's voice came out flat. He didn't move from the rocking chair. Miss Foster's smile faltered slightly, but she recovered quickly. "I'm very sorry for your loss. Mrs. Price mentioned that your wife passed recently. That must be terribly difficult." "It is." An awkward silence fell. Eleanor stepped in smoothly. "Miss Foster, perhaps you'd like to see the rest of the house. I can show you where you'd be staying if—" "I'm not staying," Caleb interrupted. He looked at Eleanor. "I told you I didn't want this." "Mr. Hartman, please." Eleanor's voice was low, urgent. "At least speak with her. You don't have to make any decisions today." "There's nothing to decide." Caleb stood carefully, still holding the sleeping baby. I'm sorry, Miss Foster. You've wasted your time coming here. Mrs. Price should not have contacted you. Rebecca Foster's pleasant expression hardened slightly. I see. Well, I appreciate your honesty, Mr. Hartman, even if I don't appreciate having traveled 2 days for nothing. She turned to Eleanor. I assume you'll be covering my travel expenses. Of course, Eleanor said quickly, and I apologize for the confusion. If you'd like to rest before heading back, that won't be necessary. Miss Foster gathered her skirts. Good day, Mrs. Price. Mr. Hartman. She left with her dignity intact but her displeasure obvious. Caleb watched her wagon disappear down the road, then turned to Eleanor. Don't do that again, he said quietly. Eleanor's jaw tightened. Mr. Hartman, I'm only trying to help. By ambushing me with strangers? The baby stirred against his shoulder, and Caleb lowered his voice. You should have asked me first. Would you have agreed? No. Exactly. Eleanor crossed her arms. You're not going to agree to anything that moves you forward. You're just going to stay here, alone, trying to manage everything by yourself until you collapse. Your wife knew that. That's why she hired me. My wife is dead. The words came out harsh, and Caleb immediately regretted them, but he didn't take them back. And I don't need you making decisions for me. Eleanor studied him for a long moment. Then she sighed. You're right. I should have told you Miss Foster was coming. That was wrong of me. She paused. But Mr. Hartman, sooner or later you're going to have to face the fact that you can't do this alone. Not long term. Why not? You're here. I'm here temporarily. Eleanor's voice was gentle but firm. I told you that from the beginning. I can help you get on your feet, teach you what you need to know, but I can't stay forever. The words hit harder than Caleb wanted to admit. He'd gotten used to having Eleanor around, used to her efficiency, her calm presence, the way she seemed to know exactly what needed doing before he even thought of it. The idea of her leaving, of being alone again with just himself and the baby, he pushed the thought away. Then stay longer. Mr. Hartman, stay until I can manage, however long that takes. He shifted the baby in his arms, feeling her small weight, her warmth. Please. Eleanor looked at him, and something complicated moved across her face. That's not a solution. That's just postponing the inevitable. Maybe, but it's what I'm asking for. The silence stretched between them. Finally, Eleanor nodded. All right, I'll stay a while longer. But Mr. Hartman, you need to at least consider the possibility that you might need more permanent help. A wife, or at least a housekeeper who can live here full time. I'll consider it, Caleb lied. Eleanor didn't look like she believed him, but she let it drop. Fine. Now, that baby needs changing, and you're going to do it. By yourself this time. Caleb did as instructed, carrying his daughter upstairs to the small nursery Eleanor had organized. As he changed the diaper with hands that were finally starting to feel competent, he looked down at the baby's face and felt that familiar surge of grief and love and terror. What would he do when Eleanor left? How would he manage? The baby stared up at him with her dark, serious eyes, and Caleb felt something twist in his chest. He still hadn't named her, couldn't bring himself to. Every time he thought about it, he heard Sarah's voice in his head, laughing as they'd thrown names back and forth during her pregnancy. Elizabeth, Catherine, Rose. None of them had felt quite right, and they'd agreed to wait until they saw her face. But Sarah never got to see her face, and Caleb couldn't choose alone. I don't know what to call you, he whispered to his daughter. Your mother was supposed to help me with that. The baby made a small sound, not quite a cry, more like a comment, as if to say, well, you'd better figure it out. Caleb finished the diaper and picked her up, cradling her against his chest. She settled immediately, her tiny fist curling against his shirt. And for just a moment, he let himself feel it, the fierce, overwhelming love he'd been trying so hard to keep at arm's length. I'm going to keep you safe, he murmured. Even if I don't know what I'm doing, even if I'm terrified, I promise. The baby sighed, a small, contented sound, and Caleb stood there in the nursery, holding his daughter, and tried to believe his own words. 2 days later, the second woman arrived. This time, Eleanor had the decency to warn him first. Mrs. Judith Carpenter will be here this afternoon, she announced over breakfast. She's a widow herself, 42 years old, with extensive experience running a household. She has no children of her own, but has helped raise her sister's 5. Caleb set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. I thought we agreed. We agreed I would stay longer. We did not agree that I would stop doing the job your wife hired me for. Eleanor's expression was stubborn. Mrs. Carpenter is an excellent match for your situation. At least meet with her. Why? So I can send her away like the last one? Maybe. Or maybe you'll find that she's exactly what you need. Eleanor leaned forward. Mr. Hartman, I know you're still grieving. I know the idea of another woman in Sarah's place feels wrong. But this isn't about replacing your wife. It's about giving that baby a stable home. She has a stable home. She has a home where her father is barely keeping his head above water and relying on a temporary housekeeper who's going to leave eventually. Eleanor's voice was blunt. That's not stability. That's borrowed time. Caleb wanted to argue, but the baby chose that moment to start fussing in her cradle. He went to her immediately, lifting her out and checking her diaper. Dry. Not hungry. She'd eaten an hour ago, just wanting to be held. He settled into the rocking chair with her, and she quieted almost immediately. It was getting easier, this father thing. He was starting to understand her different cries, her rhythms, the small signs that told him what she needed. But Eleanor was right about one thing. He was exhausted. Even with her help, the ranch was too much for one person. The cattle needed tending, the horses needed exercising, fences needed mending, and 100 other tasks piled up every day. Fine, he said finally. I'll meet with Mrs. Carpenter, but I'm not promising anything. Eleanor nodded, looking satisfied. That's all I ask. Mrs. Carpenter arrived precisely at 2 o'clock, driving her own wagon with the kind of competent efficiency that immediately reminded Caleb of Eleanor. She was a solid woman, built sturdy rather than delicate, with gray-streaked brown hair and hands that looked like they'd seen hard work. When Eleanor introduced them, she shook Caleb's hand with a firm grip and looked him straight in the eye. Mr. Hartman, she said, thank you for seeing me. I know this must be difficult. It is, Caleb admitted. At least she was honest. No false sympathy, no platitudes, just acknowledgement. Mrs. Price tells me you have a newborn. May I see her? Caleb hesitated, then gestured to the cradle where the baby was sleeping. Mrs. Carpenter moved to it with the confident step of someone who knew her way around infants. She looked down at the baby for a long moment, her expression softening. She's beautiful, she said quietly. Looks healthy. You've been taking good care of her. Eleanor has, Caleb corrected. I'm just learning. That's honest. Mrs. Carpenter straightened. Mr. Hartman, I'm going to be direct with you. I'm not looking for romance. My husband died 6 years ago, and I've made my peace with being alone. What I'm looking for is purpose and security. This ranch needs a woman's hand, and I need a place to call home. It would be a practical arrangement, nothing more. The bluntness should have been off-putting. Instead, Caleb found it almost refreshing. And if I said I wasn't interested in an arrangement of any kind? Then I'd say you're either lying to yourself or you're too proud for your own good. Mrs. Carpenter's tone was matter-of-fact. But it's your decision. I can stay for supper, let you see how I manage around a kitchen and a baby. If you don't like what you see, I'll leave in the morning. Fair? Caleb glanced at Eleanor, who was watching with carefully neutral expression. Then he looked at the baby, sleeping peacefully in her cradle. She deserved better than a father who was constantly exhausted, constantly struggling, constantly one bad day away from falling apart. Fair, he said finally. Mrs. Carpenter stayed for supper. She cooked a pot roast with vegetables that was somehow even better than Eleanor's cooking, and she managed the baby with the same calm competence Eleanor showed. When the baby fussed during the meal, Mrs. Carpenter simply picked her up, swayed her gently while stirring the gravy with her other hand, and set her back down when she'd settled. You're good with her, Caleb observed. I've had practice. My sister had 5, like I said. I helped raise all of them after their father died. Mrs. Carpenter served him a generous portion of roast. Children need routine and patience. Give them both, and they'll thrive. After supper, she washed the dishes while Eleanor tended to the baby, and Caleb found himself watching the way she moved through the kitchen. Efficient, competent, completely unromantic. It would be practical, he thought, a business arrangement. Someone to help run the ranch, care for the baby, manage the household tasks that were slowly drowning him. But when he looked at her, solid, capable, practical Mrs. Carpenter, all he could think about was how different she was from Sarah. Sarah had been slight and quick, with a laugh that filled the whole house and a habit of singing while she worked. Mrs. Carpenter was quiet and methodical, her presence steady but not warm. It wasn't her fault. She was exactly what she'd claimed to be, a practical solution to a practical problem. But Caleb realized with sudden clarity that he couldn't do it, couldn't marry someone just for convenience, couldn't bring another woman into Sarah's house and pretend it was anything other than a transaction. When Mrs. Carpenter finished the dishes, she turned to him. "Well, what do you think?" "I think you're exactly as competent as Eleanor said," Caleb told her honestly. "But I don't think this would work." Mrs. Carpenter nodded, unsurprised. "Because you're still in love with your dead wife." The words were blunt enough to make Eleanor wince, but Caleb just nodded. "Yes." "That's fair." Mrs. Carpenter dried her hands on a towel. "But Mr. Hartman, let me give you some advice. Love doesn't have to be the only reason to marry. Sometimes partnership is enough. Sometimes practical is better than passionate." "Maybe." Caleb looked at the baby, sleeping once again in her cradle. "But I'm not ready for either one." "Then I hope you get ready before that baby grows up without a mother." Mrs. Carpenter collected her shawl. "I'll leave in the morning, as promised. Thank you for your honesty." She retired to the spare room Eleanor had prepared, leaving Caleb alone with Eleanor and the baby. The older woman looked at him with something that might have been disappointment or sympathy, or both. "She was perfect for your situation," Eleanor said quietly. "I know." "And you still said no." "I did." Eleanor sighed. "Mr. Hartman, I'm trying to understand, but you're rejecting every option I present. What exactly are you looking for?" "I don't know." Caleb slumped in his chair, suddenly exhausted. "Maybe nothing. Maybe I just need time." "Time won't change anything. It'll just make you more set in your ways." Eleanor sat across from him. "Your daughter needs stability. She needs a mother figure. She has you. I'm not staying forever." The words came out sharper than Eleanor probably intended. She took a breath, visibly steadying herself. "I'm sorry. But Mr. Hartman, you have to face reality. I'm 63 years old. I'm not going to be around forever. And even if I were, I can't be a mother to your child. I'm just a temporary solution." "Then stay until I find a permanent one." "And how long will that take? Another year? 5 years? 10? Eleanor shook her head. "No, that's not fair to any of us." The baby made a sound, a small whimper that quickly escalated into a full cry. Caleb started to rise, but Eleanor waved him back. "I'll get her. You look exhausted." She lifted the baby from the cradle, checking her diaper with practiced efficiency. Wet. She carried her to the changing table, murmuring softly the whole time. "There now, sweetheart. I know. Everything's wet and cold and miserable. We'll fix it. We always fix it." Caleb watched her work, watched the gentle way she handled his daughter, the soft tone of her voice. The baby's cries quieted almost immediately, replaced by small, curious sounds as Eleanor changed her diaper and cleaned her up. "You're good with her," Caleb said quietly. "I told you. I had a daughter once." Eleanor lifted the baby, now clean and dry, and held her against her shoulder. "She was the light of my life. Losing her nearly destroyed me." "How did you survive it?" Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, swaying with the baby. "I didn't, at first. I wanted to die with her. But I had to keep living, had to find a way to go on. So I started helping other people, became a matchmaker, figured if I couldn't have my own family, I could at least help other people build theirs." She looked at him. "That's why I'm being so pushy, Mr. Hartman, because I know what it's like to lose everything. And I don't want to see you waste what you still have." Caleb felt something twist in his chest. "I'm not wasting. You're not living. There's a difference." Eleanor brought the baby over to him, placing her gently in his arms. "This child is yours. She's alive, she's here, and she needs you. really needs you, not just your body going through the motions while your heart stays buried with your wife. I don't know how to do that. Then learn. Eleanor's voice was softer now. Let yourself love her. Let yourself be her father, not just the man who keeps her alive. The baby was looking up at him with those dark, serious eyes. Sarah's eyes, he'd thought at first. But now, holding her close, he realized they weren't Sarah's eyes at all. They were their own, unique, belonging to this small person who hadn't asked to be born into grief and chaos. I'm afraid, he admitted quietly. I know. Eleanor touched his shoulder gently. But fear is no reason to hold back. She needs you, Caleb. All of you. It was the first time she'd used his given name. The informality of it, the gentleness, made something crack in his chest. He looked down at his daughter and felt tears burn behind his eyes. I don't even know what to call her, he whispered. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she said, What names did you and Sarah discuss? Lots of them. Elizabeth, Catherine, Rose, Grace. Sarah liked Grace. His voice caught, but nothing felt right. Maybe because you were waiting to see her, to know who she was. Eleanor moved to sit beside him. Look at her now. Who is she? Caleb looked, really looked, at his daughter's small, serious face, at the way her tiny fist curled against his chest, at the stubborn set of her mouth that reminded him of Sarah, yes, but also of himself, at the way she watched him with those dark eyes, as if she was trying to figure him out just as much as he was trying to figure her out. I don't know yet, he said finally, but I'd like to find out. Eleanor smiled. That's a start. The next morning, Mrs. Carpenter left with the same quiet dignity she'd arrived with. Eleanor paid her travel expenses and apologized again for the wasted trip. When the wagon disappeared down the road, Eleanor turned to Caleb with an expression that suggested she wasn't giving up. There are 3 more women I've contacted, she said. They'll be arriving over the next week. Caleb wanted to protest, wanted to tell her to cancel them all, but he just nodded tiredly. All right. All right? Eleanor looked surprised. You're not going to argue? Would it do any good? Probably not, she smiled slightly. But I appreciate you not making me fight for it. The 3rd woman arrived 2 days later. Her name was Miss Patricia Green, and she was young, barely 20, with golden hair and a nervous smile. She lasted approximately 15 minutes before the baby's crying made her burst into tears and admit that she'd never actually been around infants and was terrified of them. Eleanor sent her away with an apology and a recommendation for a different family. The 4th woman, Mrs. Helen Morrison, arrived 3 days after that. She was professional, competent, and made it very clear within the first hour that she believed children should be seen and not heard, that infants needed strict schedules and firm discipline, and that coddling led to weak character. Caleb showed her the door before Eleanor could intervene. I know she was strict, Eleanor said afterward, but she did have experience. She called my daughter spoiled. Caleb's voice was flat. She's 2 weeks old. She can't be spoiled. Eleanor opened her mouth to argue, then closed it. You're right. That was inappropriate. I'll screen the next candidates more carefully. But the 5th woman, Miss Anna Lawson, seemed perfect on paper. She was 28, had worked as a nanny for 2 different families, loved children, and approached the baby with genuine warmth. The baby even seemed to like her, settling quickly when Miss Lawson picked her up. Caleb watched them together and felt nothing. No relief, no gratitude, no sense that this was right. Just nothing. When Miss Lawson left to wash up before supper, Eleanor turned to him. Well, she's wonderful, isn't she? She's fine. Fine. Eleanor's voice rose slightly. Mr. Hartman, she's more than fine. She's exactly what you need. Young enough to keep up with a child, experienced enough to know what she's doing, and genuinely kind. What more do you want? I don't know, Caleb admitted. But it's not her. Why not? Because she's not... He stopped himself, but Eleanor's expression sharpened. She's not me, Eleanor finished quietly. The words hung in the air between them. Caleb felt heat flood his face. That's not what I was going to say. Wasn't it? Eleanor's gaze was uncomfortably penetrating. Mr. Hartman, you've rejected every woman I've sent you. The experienced ones, the young ones, the practical ones, the warm ones. The only person you want here is me. Because you know what you're doing, Caleb said defensively. Because the baby responds to you, because you understand… What? Eleanor's voice was gentle now. What do I understand that these other women don't? Caleb couldn't answer, couldn't put into words the truth that was becoming increasingly obvious, that Eleanor wasn't just helping him survive. She'd become essential. Her presence, her voice, her steady competence, the way she told stories to the baby, the way she didn't coddle him or pity him, the way she'd simply stepped into his broken life and started putting the pieces back together. I don't want them to leave, he said finally, looking at the baby sleeping in her cradle. Any of them. I want someone who will stay. I will stay, Eleanor said softly, for as long as you need me. But not forever. No, not forever. She paused. Mr. Hartman, Caleb, I think we need to have an honest conversation about what's happening here. Before she could continue, they heard Miss Lawson coming back down the stairs. Eleanor straightened, her expression shifting back to professional neutrality. We'll discuss this later. But later never came. Miss Lawson stayed for supper, proving herself competent and pleasant throughout. She even got the baby to smile, just a small, fleeting expression, but enough to make her laugh with delight. When she left the next morning, she did so with the clear expectation that Caleb would send for her once he'd made his decision. He didn't send for her, didn't send for any of them, and Eleanor, for once, didn't push. The days fell into a rhythm. Caleb worked the ranch while Eleanor managed the house and the baby. They ate meals together, took turns with the infant during the night, moved around each other with increasing ease. It was almost comfortable, this temporary arrangement, almost like a family. But Eleanor's words haunted him. You've rejected every woman I've sent you. The only person you want here is me. Was that true? Was he really so attached to Eleanor that he couldn't imagine anyone else in her role? Or was he just afraid of change, of letting another person into the life he and Sarah had built together? He didn't know. Couldn't sort through the tangle of grief and fear and growing dependence that had wrapped itself around his heart. All he knew was that when he imagined Eleanor leaving, imagined trying to manage without her, the terror was almost as bad as when Sarah had died. And that terrified him most of all. 3 weeks had passed since Eleanor arrived, and the confrontation came on a Tuesday morning when Caleb found her packing. He'd gone upstairs to fetch a clean shirt and stopped dead in the doorway of the spare room. Eleanor's carpet bag was open on the bed, half filled with her carefully folded clothes. She was placing her hairbrush inside when she noticed him standing there. Mr. Hartman. Her voice was calm, but she wouldn't quite meet his eyes. I was going to tell you after breakfast. Tell me what? But he already knew. The ice forming in his stomach told him exactly what. That it's time for me to go. Eleanor continued packing, her movements measured and deliberate. You're managing well now. The baby is thriving. You've learned everything you need to know. There's no reason for me to stay longer. No reason? Caleb's voice came out hoarse. Eleanor, you can't just… I can and I should. She finally looked at him, and her expression was sad but resolute. I told you from the beginning this was temporary. You've rejected every woman I've brought here, which tells me you're not ready for what your wife wanted. And I can't keep enabling you to avoid moving forward. I'm not avoiding anything. You're avoiding everything. Eleanor's voice was gentle but firm. You won't name your daughter. You won't consider remarrying. You won't even acknowledge that you can't do this alone long term. You're just existing, Caleb, not living. And as long as I'm here making everything easy for you, you'll never have to face that. The words hit like physical blows. Caleb gripped the doorframe, feeling the room tilt slightly. You said you'd stay as long as I needed. And I have. But need and want are different things. She folded another dress, placed it in the bag. You don't need me anymore. You're just afraid to admit it. That's not true. Isn't it? Eleanor turned to face him fully. When was the last time you fed the baby without me hovering? Yesterday morning. When was the last time you changed her without asking for help? 2 days ago. You made supper by yourself last week. Managed the washing on your own. You're capable, Caleb. You just don't believe it. Because what if I fail? The words burst out before he could stop them. What if you leave and I can't do it? What if something happens to her and you're not here to fix it? Then you'll figure it out, the same way every other parent does. Eleanor's expression softened. I'm not abandoning you. I'm giving you the space to become the father your daughter needs. She needs you. Caleb's throat tightened. When she cries, she calms for you faster than anyone. She smiles when she hears your voice. You tell her those stories and she just listens, like she understands. She'll do the same for you if you let her. Eleanor moved closer, and Caleb saw something complicated in her expression. But Caleb, you have to let yourself be her father. Really be her father, not just the man who keeps her alive while someone else does the actual parenting. I am her father. Then act like it. Name her. Love her. Stop holding yourself back because you're terrified of losing her the way you lost Sarah. The accusation hung in the air between them. Caleb wanted to deny it, wanted to tell Eleanor she was wrong, but the words stuck in his throat because they were true. He was terrified of loving his daughter completely, of letting himself be vulnerable to that kind of loss again. You don't understand, he said finally. Don't I? Eleanor's voice was sharp now. I lost my daughter, Caleb. I loved her with everything I had, and then she was gone. I know exactly what you're afraid of. But you know what? I wouldn't trade those 3 years I had with her for anything, even knowing how it ended, even knowing the pain, because loving her was worth it. That's easy to say when it's already over. It's the only thing worth saying. Eleanor stepped closer. Your daughter is alive. She's here. And every day you spend protecting yourself from loving her is a day you're wasting, a day you'll never get back. Caleb felt something crack inside his chest. I do love her. Then show it. Name her. Choose her. Stop waiting for some perfect moment that's never going to come. Eleanor's eyes were bright with emotion now. Sarah is gone, Caleb. I know that's unbearably painful, but your daughter is here, and she deserves a father who's present, not one who's so busy grieving what he lost that he can't see what he still has. You think I don't know that? Caleb's voice rose. You think I don't feel guilty every single day that I can barely look at her without seeing Sarah? That I can't hold her without thinking about what she cost? The words were out before he could stop them, raw and terrible. Eleanor's expression shifted to something that might have been shock or understanding, or both. What she cost, Eleanor repeated quietly. You blame her. No, but even as Caleb said it, he knew it was a lie. It's not her fault. I know it's not her fault. But you can't help feeling it anyway. Eleanor's voice was soft now, almost pitying. Oh, Caleb, don't. He turned away, unable to face the compassion in her eyes. Don't look at me like that. Like what? Like you understand. Like you're not judging me for being a terrible father. You're not a terrible father. Eleanor moved to stand beside him. You're a grieving man who's doing his best in an impossible situation. But Caleb, you have to stop punishing yourself, and you have to stop punishing her. You won't name her. You can barely hold her without someone telling you to. You feed her and change her and keep her alive, but you don't talk to her. Don't sing to her. Don't tell her stories the way I do. Eleanor's voice was gentle but relentless. You're keeping her at arm's length because you're afraid. But she's not going to stay a baby forever. She's going to grow up. And if you don't let yourself love her now, you're going to wake up one day and realize you've missed it all. Caleb felt tears burn behind his eyes. I don't know how to do it differently. Then let me show you. Eleanor touched his arm gently. Not as your housekeeper or your matchmaker, just as someone who's been where you are and survived it. By leaving? By giving you the push you need. She squeezed his arm. I'm not leaving today. Or tomorrow. But soon, Caleb. Because you're ready, even if you don't believe it yet. Before Caleb could respond, the baby started crying downstairs. Eleanor moved toward the door, but Caleb stopped her. Let me, he said quietly. Eleanor studied him for a moment, then nodded. All right. Caleb went downstairs alone. The baby was in her cradle, her tiny face scrunched up in distress. He lifted her carefully, checking her diaper, dry, and tried to remember the last time she'd eaten. An hour ago? 2? Time was still a blur sometimes. He settled into the rocking chair, cradling her against his chest. She continued crying, her small body rigid with whatever infant distress had overtaken her. Caleb swayed gently, the way Eleanor had taught him, and tried to find words. "I'm sorry," he whispered to his daughter. "I'm so sorry I'm not better at this. I'm trying. I swear I'm trying." The baby's cries didn't stop, but they changed slightly, less desperate, more questioning, as if she was listening to him even through her distress. "Your mother would have known what to do," Caleb continued, his voice rough. "She was good at everything. Good at running the ranch, good at making this house a home. She would have been good at being your mother." He paused, feeling tears slip down his cheeks. "And I'm angry at her for leaving, for dying when you needed her, when I needed her." The admission felt like ripping something open inside himself, but once he started, he couldn't stop. "I'm angry at you sometimes too," he said softly, "and I hate myself for it. You didn't ask to be born, didn't ask for any of this, but when I look at you, all I can think about is what I lost to have you, and that's not fair, that's not your fault." The baby had stopped crying now. She was looking up at him with those dark, serious eyes, and Caleb felt something shift in his chest. "You look like her," he whispered, "but you're not her, you're your own person, and I need to stop being so afraid of that." He touched her tiny hand, felt her fingers curl around his thumb. "Eleanor's right. I've been protecting myself from loving you. Because if I let myself love you the way I loved your mother, and then I lose you—" His voice broke. The baby made a small sound, and her grip on his thumb tightened. "But that's not living, is it?" Caleb continued after a moment. "That's just existing, just surviving, and you deserve better than a father who's just surviving." He sat there in the rocking chair, holding his daughter, and let himself feel everything he'd been pushing away for 3 weeks. The grief, the fear, the guilt, the anger. And underneath it all, terrifying and undeniable, the love. He loved her, this small, helpless person who'd cost him everything and given him nothing yet but sleepless nights and endless worry. He loved her so much it felt like drowning. "I'm going to try," he told her. "I'm going to try to be the father you need, even if I'm terrified, even if I don't know what I'm doing, because Eleanor's right. You're here, you're alive, and I can't keep wasting the time we have together being afraid." The baby's eyes were drifting closed now, her tiny body relaxing against his chest. Caleb continued rocking, continued holding her, and felt something in his heart begin to heal. When Eleanor came downstairs 20 minutes later, she found them both asleep in the rocking chair. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching, and something complicated moved across her face. Then she quietly went back upstairs to finish her packing. Caleb woke to find Eleanor making supper. The baby was still asleep against his chest, her breathing soft and even. His neck was stiff from the angle he'd been sitting at, but he didn't want to move and risk waking her. Eleanor glanced over at him and smiled. "You've been asleep for 2 hours." 2 hours? Caleb shifted carefully. "Why didn't you wake me?" "Because you both needed the rest." She stirred something on the stove. "And because I wanted to see if you could do it. Hold her that long without panicking." "Did I pass the test?" "With flying colors." Eleanor's smile widened. "You're more capable than you think, Caleb." They ate supper together in companionable silence, the baby sleeping peacefully in her cradle beside the table. It felt domestic, comfortable, like they'd been doing this for years instead of weeks, and that comfort, Caleb realized, was part of the problem. "When are you planning to leave?" he asked quietly. Eleanor set down her fork. "I was thinking the end of the week. That's 3 days." "Yes." Caleb looked at his daughter, then back at Eleanor. "What if I asked you not to go?" "Then I'd ask you why." Eleanor's gaze was steady, and I'd need a better answer than because I'm afraid to do it alone. "What if the answer is because I don't want you to go?" The words came out before Caleb could think them through. "What if it's because you've become—" He stopped, unsure how to finish. "Because I've become what?" Eleanor's voice was soft, almost careful. Important, Caleb finished, to both of us. She settles for you in ways she doesn't for anyone else. And He paused, trying to find words for something he didn't fully understand himself. I rely on you, not just for help with the baby or the house, but for what, Caleb? He met her eyes and felt something shift between them. For making this bearable. For making me believe I can do this. For seeing me at my worst and not walking away. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was measured. What exactly are you asking me? I don't know. Caleb ran a hand through his hair, frustrated with his own inability to articulate what he was feeling. I just know that when I think about you leaving, I feel the same panic I felt when Sarah died. Like I'm losing something essential, something I can't function without. That's dependence, not... Eleanor stopped herself, shook her head. Caleb, you're confusing gratitude with something else. I've helped you through an impossible time. It's natural to feel attached to me. But that doesn't mean what? It doesn't mean we should complicate this more than it already is. Eleanor stood, began clearing the dishes with brisk efficiency. I came here to do a job, find you a wife, help you get on your feet. I've done half of that. The other half clearly isn't going to happen. So it's time for me to go. What if I don't want another wife? Caleb stood as well. What if I just want you to stay? As what? Your permanent housekeeper? Eleanor's voice had an edge now. Caleb, I'm 63 years old. I'm not going to spend whatever years I have left taking care of someone else's household. Then not as a housekeeper, as... He struggled for words. As someone who matters. As family. Eleanor's hand stilled on the dishes. She turned slowly to face him. What are you saying? I'm saying I don't want you to leave. Caleb moved closer. I'm saying that somewhere in the past 3 weeks, you stopped being the matchmaker my dead wife hired and became someone I can't imagine living without. Caleb, I'm saying that when I look at you with my daughter, I don't see a temporary solution. I see the person who saved us both. His voice dropped. And I'm saying that if you're determined to leave, the least you can do is tell me the real reason why. Eleanor's expression was complicated, surprise and something else Caleb couldn't quite read. The real reason is exactly what I told you. You need to learn to stand on your own. That's not all of it. Caleb studied her face. You're running. I don't know from what, but you're running. I am not. You are. He moved closer still. You've spent 3 weeks teaching me not to be afraid, telling me to face what scares me, but you won't do the same thing. There's nothing for me to face. But Eleanor's voice wavered slightly. Isn't there? Caleb reached out, touched her arm gently. Eleanor, what are you afraid of? She pulled away from his touch, moving to the other side of the kitchen. When she spoke, her back was to him. I'm afraid of watching another child grow up. I'm afraid of letting myself care too much and then having to leave. I'm afraid of... Her voice caught. I'm afraid of becoming attached to something that isn't mine to keep. The admission hung in the air. Caleb felt his chest tighten with understanding. The baby, he said softly. You're attached to her. Of course I'm attached to her. Eleanor's shoulders were rigid. I've spent 3 weeks caring for her, feeding her, soothing her in the middle of the night. I've told her stories and sang her songs and watched her grow stronger every day. How could I not be attached? Then why leave? Because she's not mine. Eleanor whirled to face him, and there were tears on her cheeks. She's not my daughter. She's not my granddaughter. She's not anything to me except a job I was hired to help with. And the longer I stay, the more I forget that. Caleb stared at her, seeing clearly for the first time the pain she'd been hiding behind her competent, no-nonsense exterior. You love her. Eleanor's voice broke. It doesn't matter. It matters more than anything. Caleb crossed the kitchen to stand before her. Eleanor, you love her, and she loves you, and He paused, took a breath. I think I'm starting to understand why I couldn't accept any of those other women. Eleanor looked up at him, her eyes bright with tears. Don't. Don't what? Don't say something we'll both regret. Her voice was almost pleading. Caleb, you're grieving. You're vulnerable. You're confusing gratitude and dependence with something they're not. Am I? He held her gaze. Or are you so busy protecting yourself that you can't see what's actually happening here? Nothing is happening here. But even as Eleanor said it, she didn't sound convinced. Something's been happening since you arrived. Caleb's voice was quiet but certain. Maybe I didn't see it at first because I was too lost in grief, and maybe you didn't see it because you were too focused on doing your job. But it's there, Eleanor. We both know it. Eleanor shook her head, but she didn't move away. This is a mistake. Why? Because you're older than me? Because you came here as a matchmaker? Because Sarah hired you? Caleb reached up, gently wiped a tear from her cheek. Or because you're as afraid as I am? All of those reasons. Eleanor's voice was barely a whisper. And because your wife trusted me to help you, not to what? Care about us? Become part of our lives? He paused. Fall in love with my daughter? I didn't mean to. The admission came out broken. I tried to keep my distance, tried to stay professional, but she's so small, and she needs so much, and when she looks at me with those serious eyes, Eleanor's voice broke completely. I can't do this again, Caleb. I can't let myself love someone and then lose them. Then don't lose us. The words came out with absolute certainty. Stay. Not as a temporary housekeeper or a matchmaker. Stay as yourself, as Eleanor. And what does that make me? Your employee. Your charity case. It makes you family. Caleb said it simply, knowing it was true. It makes you the person who helped us survive when we were drowning. The person who loves my daughter. The person I've come to... He stopped, the words too big and too frightening to say aloud, but Eleanor heard them anyway. Don't, she said again, but there was less conviction in it now. Why not? Because it complicates things? Everything's already complicated. He took her hand, felt it trembling in his. Eleanor, I'm not asking you to replace Sarah. I'm not asking you to be something you're not. I'm just asking you to stay. For how long? As long as you want. He squeezed her hand gently. As long as we need each other. Eleanor looked at him, and in her eyes Caleb saw the same fear and hope and confusion he felt in his own chest. This is madness. Probably. He managed a small smile. But I've been mad with grief for 3 weeks. Maybe this is a better kind of madness. Caleb, she started to say something else, but the baby chose that moment to wake with a sharp, demanding cry. They both moved at once, then stopped, looking at each other. Eleanor gestured toward the cradle. You get her. I'll warm a bottle. Caleb lifted his daughter from the cradle, and she quieted slightly at his touch. He held her against his shoulder, swaying gently, and watched Eleanor prepare the bottle with the same efficient movements she'd shown him a dozen times. But this time, when she handed him the bottle, their fingers touched and held for just a moment longer than necessary. I'm still leaving at the end of the week, Eleanor said quietly. Caleb's heart sank. Eleanor, I need time to think, to figure out what I'm doing. She stepped back. But I'm not saying no. I'm just saying I need time. It wasn't what Caleb wanted, but it was more than he'd had a few minutes ago. All right. He fed the baby while Eleanor finished the dishes, and the silence between them was charged with everything they hadn't said. When the baby was fed and changed and sleeping again, Eleanor retreated upstairs to her room and closed the door. Caleb sat alone in the darkening parlor, holding his daughter, and tried to understand what had just happened. He'd admitted feelings he hadn't known he had. Eleanor had admitted to loving the baby, and somehow, in the space of a single conversation, everything had shifted. He looked down at his daughter's sleeping face. What do you think? He whispered. Did I just make a complete fool of myself? The baby, of course, didn't answer, but her tiny hand was curled around his thumb, holding on tight, and Caleb took that as a good sign. The next 3 days were strange. Eleanor continued her work around the house with the same efficiency as before, but there was a tension beneath it now. She and Caleb moved around each other carefully, like dancers who'd forgotten the steps. They spoke about necessary things, the baby's feeding schedule, repairs that needed making, supplies that needed buying, but avoided anything deeper. At night, Caleb lay awake in his empty bed and wondered if he'd ruined everything. Wondered if Eleanor would leave at the end of the week and never come back. Wondered what the hell he'd been thinking, confessing feelings to a woman he'd known less than a month. But then he'd remember the look in her eyes when she'd admitted to loving the baby. Remember the way her hand had trembled in his. Remember the moment when everything had cracked open between them and he'd seen the truth underneath. She felt it too. Whatever this was, attachment, affection, something more complicated than either of those, she felt it too. On the third day, Caleb was in the barn repairing a broken stall door when Eleanor appeared in the doorway. She stood there for a moment, backlit by the afternoon sun, and Caleb's breath caught at the sight of her. "I've been thinking," she said without preamble. Caleb set down his hammer. "About leaving?" "About staying." Eleanor moved closer, picking her way carefully across the barn floor. "About what you said. About family." "And?" She was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "I told you I lost my daughter 40 years ago. What I didn't tell you was that she was all I had left. My husband died in the same epidemic. My parents were already gone. My siblings had moved east. Losing her meant losing everything." Caleb waited, letting her speak. "I swore I'd never put myself in that position again," Eleanor continued. "Never let myself care that much about someone I could lose. So I became a matchmaker, helped other people find families while keeping myself carefully separate. It was safe, predictable." She looked up at him. "And lonely. So unbearably lonely." "Eleanor, let me finish." She took a breath. "These past 3 weeks have been the first time in 40 years that I've felt like I belonged somewhere, like I was part of something instead of just observing it. And that terrifies me, Caleb, because I don't know how to do this. Don't know how to let myself care without being consumed by fear of losing it all again." "I don't know either," Caleb admitted. "I'm terrified every single day that something will happen to the baby, that I'll fail her, that I'll lose her the way I lost Sarah. Then we're both fools." "Probably." He moved closer. "But maybe we can be fools together." Eleanor smiled despite the tears on her cheeks. "That's not very romantic." "I'm not trying to be romantic. I'm trying to be honest." He reached out, took her hand. "I don't know what this is, Eleanor. I don't know if it's just circumstance or grief or something real, but I know I don't want you to leave, and I know that my daughter needs you, that we both need you." "Need isn't love." "No," Caleb agreed, "but it's a start." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. Then, slowly, she squeezed his hand. "I'll stay, but on one condition." "Name it." "You name her." Eleanor's voice was firm. "Your daughter. You give her a name, not because I'm asking you to, but because she deserves one, because she's not just the baby anymore. She's a person, your person, and it's time you acknowledge that." The words hit home. Caleb nodded slowly. "All right. When?" "Tonight." He took a breath. "We'll do it together. All three of us." Eleanor smiled, and it was the first real smile he'd seen from her in days. "All right." That evening, they sat together in the parlor with the baby between them. She was awake but peaceful, her dark eyes moving between them as if she knew something important was happening. Caleb looked at his daughter, really looked at her without the veil of grief and fear, and tried to see who she was. Not who Sarah had wanted her to be, not what he was afraid she'd become, just who she was right now, in this moment. She was small, but strong. She'd survived her mother's death, her father's incompetence, 3 weeks of chaos and grief. She was stubborn, fought sleep, fought feeding, fought anything she didn't like. But she was also curious, always watching, always listening, as if she was trying to understand this strange world she'd been born into. And there was something in her expression, in the set of her tiny jaw and the way her eyes tracked everything around her that spoke of determination, of someone who wouldn't give up easily. "Hope," he said quietly. Eleanor looked at him. "What?" "Her name. Hope." Caleb touched his daughter's tiny hand. "Because that's what she is, what she represents. The hope that even when everything falls apart, something good can still survive." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "It's perfect. Hope Hartman." Caleb lifted his daughter carefully, held her close. "Named for what she's given me. for what we've all found, even in the darkest time. He looked at Eleanor, saw the same emotion reflected in her face, and in that moment, holding his newly named daughter with Eleanor beside him, Caleb felt something he hadn't felt since Sarah died. Not happiness, not yet, but something close to it. Something that felt almost like peace. "Welcome to the family, Hope," Eleanor whispered, reaching out to touch the baby's cheek. "All of us." The storm came 3 days after Hope got her name. It started as a whisper of wind across the Montana plains, the kind of late autumn weather that made ranchers check their supplies and secure their livestock. Caleb had been through enough Montana winters to recognize the signs, the peculiar yellow-gray cast to the sky, the way the cattle bunched together near the barn, the absolute stillness in the air that meant nature was holding its breath. He'd spent the morning reinforcing the barn doors and bringing the chickens into their shelter. Eleanor had been preparing the house, filling every container with water from the well, checking the woodpile, making sure they had enough food to last several days if necessary. Hope had been fussy all morning, as if she too could sense the coming change. By afternoon, the first snowflakes began to fall. "It's early for this," Eleanor said, standing at the kitchen window with Hope in her arms. "Even for Montana. Season doesn't care about calendars." Caleb came in from the barn, stomping snow from his boots. "We're in for a bad one. I can feel it." He was right. By evening, the snow was falling so thick they couldn't see the barn from the house. The wind howled around the corners of the building, rattling windows and finding every crack in the walls. Caleb had built up the fire until the parlor was almost uncomfortably warm, but he knew they'd need that heat to last through what was coming. Eleanor had put Hope down for the night, swaddling her carefully in extra blankets. The baby had fallen asleep surprisingly easily, as if exhausted by her fussiness earlier. Caleb and Eleanor sat together by the fire, listening to the storm rage outside. "I've been through worse," Caleb said, more to himself than to Eleanor. "We'll be fine." "Of course we will." But Eleanor's voice was tight with worry. "The cattle?" "In the near pasture. They'll bunch together, stay warm enough. Horses are in the barn." He poked at the fire. "We just have to wait it out." They sat in silence for a while, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the shriek of wind outside. Then Eleanor said quietly, "I wrote to the matchmaking office. Told them I was ending the contract." Caleb looked at her sharply. "When?" "Yesterday, before the snow." She kept her eyes on the fire. "I told them the situation had changed, that you no longer required their services." "What did you tell them about you? About why you're staying?" Eleanor smiled slightly. "I told them I'd found a position as a permanent housekeeper, which is technically true, even if it's not the whole truth." "And what is the whole truth?" Caleb asked softly. She turned to face him then, and in the firelight her expression was open in a way he'd never seen before. "The truth is that I'm staying because I can't imagine leaving. Because when I think about walking away from you and Hope, I feel like I'm being torn in half." She paused. "The truth is that I'm terrified and hopeful and confused all at once, and I have no idea what I'm doing. That makes two of us." Caleb reached for her hand. "But we'll figure it out." "Will we?" Eleanor's fingers curled around his. "Caleb, I need you to understand something. I'm not Sarah. I can't be her. I won't try to be. I'm not asking you to be. Aren't you?" She held his gaze. "When you look at me, when you ask me to stay, what exactly are you asking for?" Caleb was quiet for a long moment, considering the question honestly. "I'm asking for what's already happening. You, here, helping me raise Hope, being part of our lives, being," struggled for the right word, "being family." "Just family?" "I don't know." The admission felt important. "I know I care about you. I know I depend on you. I know that when you smile at Hope, something in my chest feels lighter. But Eleanor, I'm still grieving Sarah. I don't know when that will end or what will be left when it does." "That's honest, at least." Eleanor squeezed his hand. "I can work with honest." "What about you?" Caleb turned the question back. "What are you asking for?" Eleanor was quiet for so long he thought she might not answer. Then she said, I'm asking for permission to love your daughter without feeling like I'm overstepping. I'm asking for time to figure out what we are to each other. And I'm asking you to not expect more from me than I can give. I won't. Good, she smiled. Because I have no idea what I'm doing either. They sat together as the storm raged, hands linked, watching the fire burn down. Eventually Eleanor dozed off, her head tipping against Caleb's shoulder. He sat very still, afraid to wake her, and let himself feel the weight of her trust. She was here. She was staying. Whatever came next, they'd face it together. The storm lasted through the night and into the next day. By morning, snow had drifted against the house so high it covered the lower windows. The temperature had dropped brutally, and even with the fire roaring, the edges of the rooms were frigid. Caleb made trip after trip to the woodpile, grateful he'd stocked it well before winter set in. Hope woke with the dawn, and her cry was different than usual, thin and reedy, almost weak. Eleanor was up immediately, lifting the baby from her cradle with practiced hands. "She's hot," Eleanor said, pressing her hand to Hope's forehead. "Caleb, she's burning up." Fear sliced through him. Caleb was at Eleanor's side in 2 strides, touching Hope's cheek. The baby's skin was flushed and far too warm, and when she cried again, the sound was wrong, strained and desperate. "What do we do?" His voice came out tight. "Cool cloths. Water if we can get her to take it." Eleanor was already moving, laying Hope on the table and beginning to unwrap her swaddling. "We need to bring her fever down." They worked together with the kind of desperate efficiency that came from shared fear. Eleanor stripped Hope down to her diaper while Caleb fetched cool water from the basin. They sponged the baby down gently, trying to cool her fever without chilling her too much. Hope cried weakly through it all, her tiny body shuddering. "It's all right, sweetheart," Eleanor murmured, her voice steady even though her hands were shaking. "We've got you. We're going to make you better." But as the morning wore on, Hope got worse. Her fever climbed despite their efforts. She wouldn't eat, turning her head away from the bottle and crying in thin, painful bursts. Her breathing became rapid and shallow, and dark circles appeared under her eyes. "We need a doctor," Caleb said, pacing the kitchen while Eleanor held Hope. "I'll ride to town." "In this storm?" Eleanor's voice was sharp. "Caleb, you'd freeze before you got halfway there. The snow is 4 feet deep in places." "Then what do we do?" He felt panic rising in his throat. "Eleanor, what do we do?" "We keep doing what we're doing. We keep her cool, keep trying to get fluids in her, and we watch." Eleanor's face was pale but determined. "And we don't give up." The day stretched into the longest of Caleb's life. Longer even than the day Sarah died, because at least then he'd known the outcome was beyond his control. This time, Hope's life hung in the balance of what he and Eleanor could do, and the weight of that responsibility was crushing. They took turns holding Hope, sponging her down, trying to coax water into her. The baby grew weaker as the hours passed, her cries fading to whimpers. By afternoon, she was barely moving, her tiny chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow breaths. Caleb sat with her while Eleanor prepared another cool cloth, and he felt the same helpless terror he'd felt in those first days after Sarah died. He was going to lose her. After everything, after finally naming her, after finally letting himself love her, he was going to lose her. "No," he whispered fiercely, holding Hope close. "No, you don't get to leave. You hear me? You're a Hartman. We don't give up. We fight." Hope's eyes fluttered open at the sound of his voice. Those dark, serious eyes that had watched him so intently since the day she was born. She looked at him, and Caleb felt something break open in his chest. "I'm sorry," he told her, tears streaming down his face. "I'm so sorry I wasted time being afraid. I'm sorry I held back. But I'm not holding back anymore, you understand? I love you. I love you so much it terrifies me. So you have to fight. You have to stay." Eleanor returned with the cloth and stopped in the doorway, seeing Caleb's face. She set the cloth down and came to sit beside him, placing her hand on his shoulder. "She's strong," Eleanor said quietly. "Stronger than we know. What if she's not strong enough? Then we'll have loved her as much as we could for as long as we had." Eleanor's voice was thick with emotion. "But Caleb, she's still fighting. Look at her. She's still here." It was true. Hope's eyes were still open, still watching him. Her breathing was shallow but steady. She was fighting. They worked through the afternoon and into the evening, taking turns holding Hope, cooling her fever, talking to her in steady, soothing voices. Eleanor told her stories, the same stories she'd been telling since the first night, about clever foxes and determined rabbits and small creatures who survived against impossible odds. Caleb talked to her about Sarah, about the ranch, about all the things he'd teach her when she was well. Night fell, and still the storm raged. The house was an island of warmth and light in a world of howling darkness. Caleb had lost all sense of time. All that existed was hope, breathing in his arms, fighting to stay alive. Somewhere around midnight, Eleanor dozed off in her chair, exhausted. Caleb sat alone with Hope, rocking her gently, and felt the weight of every choice that had led to this moment. If he'd been a better father from the start, would she be healthier? If he'd sent for the doctor sooner before the storm hit, would she be safe in town instead of fighting for her life in his arms? "I failed your mother," he whispered to Hope. "I couldn't save her. And now I'm failing you. I don't know what to do. I don't know how to make you better." Hope made a small sound, not quite a cry, but a response. Her tiny hand moved, fingers curling weakly against his chest. "But I'm not giving up," Caleb continued fiercely. "You hear me? I'm not giving up on you. Whatever it takes, however long it takes, I'm going to keep fighting, because you're my daughter, you're Hope, and Hope doesn't die easy." He held her close, feeling her small body against his, and prayed to anything that might be listening. Not formal prayers, he'd never been much for religion, but desperate, wordless pleas. "Please, please let her live. Please don't take her from me. Please." Dawn came slowly, gray light filtering through the frost-covered windows. The storm had lessened but not stopped, snow still falling in thick, lazy flakes. Eleanor woke stiff and disoriented, then immediately focused on Hope. "How is she?" "Still fighting." Caleb's voice was hoarse from hours of talking. "Fever hasn't broken, but it hasn't gotten worse either." Eleanor came to check Hope, pressing her hand to the baby's forehead, feeling her pulse, watching her breathing. Then she looked at Caleb, and something shifted in her expression. "She's holding her own," Eleanor said quietly. "That's something." "Is it enough?" "It has to be." She touched Hope's cheek gently. "Come on, little one. Keep fighting." The second day of the storm was worse than the first. Hope's fever spiked again mid-morning, and this time nothing they did seemed to help. She became limp in their arms, her breathing so shallow Caleb had to press his ear to her chest to hear her heartbeat. "She's not going to make it," he said, the words torn from somewhere deep inside him. "Eleanor, she's—" "Don't!" Eleanor's voice was sharp. "Don't you dare give up on her. Not now, not when she's fought this hard. But look at her. I am looking at her, and I see a baby who's still breathing, still here, still fighting." Eleanor took Hope from his arms, cradling her close. "And if she's still fighting, then so are we." She began walking the length of the kitchen, holding Hope against her shoulder, swaying and talking in that same steady voice she'd used since the first night. "There was once a little rabbit who lived in a burrow at the edge of the woods. Everyone said she was too small to survive the winter, that she'd never make it through the cold and the snow. But the little rabbit was stubborn. She'd curl up tight in her burrow, and when the wind howled outside, she'd think about spring, about the flowers that would bloom and the warm sun on her fur. And she'd tell herself, 'Just one more day, just survive one more day.'" Caleb listened to Eleanor's story, watched her walk with Hope, and felt something in him shift. She was right. Hope was still alive, still fighting, and as long as she was fighting, they couldn't give up. He stood and moved to Eleanor's side. "What do you need me to do?" "Warm some broth, just a little. We need to get something in her, even if it's just a few drops." Eleanor continued her steady pacing. "And then you're going to tell her about her mother, about Sarah. She needs to know where she comes from." Caleb warmed the broth with shaking hands, then brought it to Eleanor. Together they managed to get a few drops into Hope's mouth. She didn't swallow at first, but then her throat moved weakly. A few more drops, then a few more. "That's it," Eleanor encouraged. "That's good, sweetheart. Just a little more." When Hope wouldn't take any more, Eleanor handed her back to Caleb. Now talk to her. Tell her about Sarah. Caleb settled into the rocking chair, holding his daughter close. His throat was tight with emotion, but he forced himself to speak. Your mother's name was Sarah, he began quietly. Sarah Catherine Webb before she married me. She was the most beautiful woman I ever saw, but she'd have hated me saying that. She always said she was too practical to be beautiful, that beautiful women didn't have calluses on their hands or dirt under their nails. Hope's breathing was still shallow, but her eyes were open now, watching him. She loved this ranch, Caleb continued. Loved the way the hills looked at sunset, loved the sound of the wind through the grass. She planted that garden outside, vegetables and flowers all mixed together because she said, life should have beauty alongside usefulness. She sang while she worked. Terrible singer, actually, but it made the house feel alive. Eleanor had settled into the other chair, listening. Tears were streaming down her face, but she didn't interrupt. She wanted you so badly, Caleb said, his voice breaking. We'd been trying for years. Every month we'd hope, and every month we'd be disappointed. And then finally, you came. She was so happy, Hope, so excited to meet you. She made plans, what she'd teach you, how she'd raise you, all the things you'd do together. He had to stop, emotion overwhelming him. Eleanor reached over and took his hand, squeezing it gently. She died bringing you into the world, Caleb continued after a moment. And I blamed you for that. I'm so ashamed to admit it, but I did. Every time I looked at you, all I could see was what I'd lost. But Hope, he touched her tiny cheek. You're not what I lost. You're what she gave me, her last gift, the best thing she ever did. Hope's hand moved, curling weakly around his finger. The grip was faint, barely there, but it was something. So you have to live, Caleb whispered fiercely. You have to fight through this and live, because you're all I have left of her. You're proof that she was here, that she mattered, that our love made something beautiful. He leaned down, pressed a kiss to her hot forehead. Please, Hope. Please don't leave me. The day wore on. They continued their vigil, taking turns holding Hope, cooling her fever, getting drops of water and broth into her when she'd take them. Eleanor told more stories. Caleb talked about Sarah, about the ranch, about everything he could think of. And slowly, impossibly, Hope's breathing steadied. By evening of the second day, her fever had dropped slightly. Not broken, but lower than it had been. She was still weak, still fighting, but there was a spark in her eyes that hadn't been there that morning. She's turning a corner, Eleanor said, cautious hope in her voice. I think she's going to make it. Caleb was afraid to believe it, afraid to hope. But when Hope took the bottle that evening, just a little, but more than she'd taken all day, he felt something unlock in his chest. Come on, sweetheart, he murmured as she drank. That's it. You're doing so well. That night, Caleb and Eleanor took turns sleeping in short shifts, neither willing to leave Hope alone. The storm had finally broken, leaving behind a world transformed by snow. Stars appeared between the clouds, cold and distant and beautiful. Caleb stood at the window with Hope in his arms, looking out at the snow-covered landscape. Your mother would have loved this, he told her softly. The way everything looks clean and new after a storm. She always said snow was nature's way of starting over. Behind him, Eleanor stirred in her chair. Is her fever down? Yes. Caleb turned and there were tears on his face. Eleanor, I think she's going to be all right. Eleanor came to check, pressing her hand to Hope's forehead. The baby's skin was still warm but no longer burning. Her breathing was steady and deep. Her eyes were closed, but it was sleep now, not the dangerous unconsciousness of before. Thank heavens, Eleanor whispered. She wrapped her arms around both of them, Caleb and Hope together, and they stood there in the quiet house, holding each other and the baby who'd fought so hard to stay with them. I was so scared, Caleb admitted, his voice muffled against Eleanor's hair. So was I. Eleanor pulled back to look at him. But she made it. She's strong, Caleb, just like her parents. I couldn't have done this without you. He held her gaze. When I thought we were losing her, when I didn't know what to do, you kept me going, kept us both going. We kept each other going. Eleanor touched his face gently. That's what family does. The word hung between them, heavier now with everything they'd just been through. Family, not by blood or marriage or any traditional measure, but by choice. By standing together through the worst and not walking away. Eleanor, Caleb said quietly, I need to tell you something. All right. I don't know what we are. I don't know what to call this thing between us. But I know that when I thought Hope might die, when I was sitting there holding her and begging her to live, you were there beside me. Not as an employee or a temporary help or even as a friend. You were there as, he struggled for words, as someone who loves her as much as I do. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. I do love her. So much it frightens me. I know. He shifted Hope carefully to one arm, then reached out and took Eleanor's hand with the other. And I think I'm starting to love you too. Not like I loved Sarah. Different, but real. Eleanor drew in a sharp breath. Caleb, I'm not asking for anything, he said quickly. I'm not expecting you to say it back or to change anything between us. I just needed you to know. After tonight, after coming so close to losing her, I needed you to know the truth. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, tears streaming down her face. Then she said softly, I think I'm starting to love you too, both of you. And it terrifies me because I swore I'd never let myself care this much again. But Caleb, I can't help it. You've become, her voice broke. You've both become essential. Caleb pulled her close, careful not to jostle Hope between them. They stood there in the lamplight, the three of them together, and felt the weight of what they'd survived. We're going to be all right, Eleanor whispered. All of us. Yes, Caleb agreed. We are. Hope stirred in his arms, making a small sound. Not distress this time, but something that almost sounded content. Her fever continued to drop through the night, and by morning it had broken completely. She was weak and tired, but her eyes were clear and focused. When Eleanor picked her up, Hope made a small cooing sound that might have been recognition. There you are, Eleanor said, tears streaming freely now. There's our brave girl. Caleb watched them together, Eleanor holding Hope with such tenderness, the baby looking up at her with trust, and felt something settle in his chest. This was his family now. Not the family he'd imagined with Sarah, not the traditional family he'd thought he was supposed to have, but family nonetheless. The storm had forced them together in the most desperate circumstances possible, and they'd survived. More than survived. They'd chosen each other. Chosen to stay, to fight, to love, despite the fear. 3 days after the storm ended, a rider finally made it through to check on them. It was Tom Chen from the neighboring ranch, worried about whether they'd survived. We heard it was bad out here, Tom said, stamping snow from his boots. Wanted to make sure you were all right. That the baby, she's fine, Caleb said quickly. She got sick during the storm, fever, but she pulled through. That's good. That's real good. Tom looked around the tidy house, at Eleanor in the kitchen with Hope, at the obvious signs of two people who'd weathered something difficult together. Heard you had help. Mrs. Price, right? The matchmaker? She's not... Caleb paused, looked at Eleanor. She's staying on, permanently, as... He wasn't sure what to call her. Eleanor looked up from where she was preparing Hope's bottle. As family, she said simply. I'm staying as family. Tom nodded, though his expression suggested he found the arrangement unusual, but he was too polite to comment. Well, that's good. Ranch is too big for one person anyway, and a baby needs... He gestured vaguely. Well, needs what she's got here. After Tom left, Caleb and Eleanor looked at each other. As family, Caleb repeated softly. As family, Eleanor confirmed. She smiled. Is that all right? It's more than all right. He moved to stand beside her, looking down at Hope. It's everything. The baby looked up at both of them, and for just a moment, Caleb could have sworn she smiled. A real smile, not just gas or reflex, but recognition, understanding, as if she knew exactly what they'd all survived together and approved. They'd made it through the storm, all three of them, together. And whatever came next, they'd face it the same way. As family, chosen and hard-won and absolutely real. Spring came slowly to Montana, melting the snow inch by stubborn inch and revealing the brown earth beneath. By the time the first green shoots appeared in Sarah's garden, Hope was 4 months old and thriving in ways Caleb had barely dared to imagine during those dark, early weeks. She'd grown stronger after the storm, as if surviving that fever had somehow fortified her. Her cheeks had filled out, her legs had grown plump and sturdy, and she'd started making sounds that weren't just cries, little coos and gurgles that seemed almost conversational. Eleanor swore she was advanced for her age, though Caleb suspected that was just pride talking. But the thing that amazed him most was how Hope had become the center of their lives in a way that felt natural rather than burdensome. Every morning when he woke, his first thought was of her. Every decision he made about the ranch, he made with her future in mind. And when she smiled, which she did now, real smiles that lit up her whole face, Caleb felt a joy so profound it sometimes brought him to tears. Eleanor had settled into the ranch as if she'd always been there. She'd taken over the garden completely, planting vegetables and herbs with the kind of methodical care that suggested she was building something meant to last. She'd reorganized the kitchen to her liking, hung curtains she'd sewn herself in the windows, and established routines that gave structure to their days. But more than that, she'd become essential in ways Caleb hadn't expected. She was the one who noticed when Hope was cutting teeth and knew what to do about it. She was the one who suggested they move the cradle into a proper nursery upstairs, who insisted Caleb needed to maintain the ranch buildings before they fell into disrepair, who reminded him to shave and change his shirt before going to town. She managed the household accounts, dealt with the feed suppliers, and somehow made the ranch run more smoothly than it had even when Sarah was alive. But it was the small moments that meant the most. The way Eleanor would hum while she worked, filling the house with the same kind of life Sarah's singing once had. The way she'd catch Caleb's eye across the room and smile, sharing some private amusement. The way she'd rest her hand on his shoulder when she passed his chair, a casual touch that spoke of comfort and belonging. They hadn't spoken again about what had passed between them during the storm. The admission of love, tentative and frightened but real, hung between them like something precious and fragile. Neither of them seemed to know what to do with it, so they simply existed around it, letting whatever was growing between them develop at its own pace. It was Eleanor who finally brought it up again, on a warm April evening when Hope had fallen asleep early and they were sitting together on the porch watching the sun set over the hills. "We need to talk about what happens next," Eleanor said quietly. Caleb had been dreading this conversation. "What do you mean?" "I mean, we've been existing in this strange limbo for 3 months. I'm here, but I'm not officially anything, not your housekeeper, not your—" She paused. "Not anything that makes sense to the outside world." "Does it need to make sense to the outside world?" "Eventually, yes." Eleanor turned to look at him. "People are already talking, Caleb. I heard it in town last week. Questions about who I am, why I'm here, what our arrangement is." "Let them talk." Caleb's voice was more defensive than he intended. "It's none of their business. It becomes their business when it affects Hope." Eleanor's tone was gentle but firm. "She's going to grow up in this community. People will judge her based on what they think is happening here. We need to give them something they can understand." "Like what?" Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Like marriage." The word landed between them with unexpected weight. Caleb felt his chest tighten. "Eleanor, hear me out." She held up her hand. "I'm not talking about a love match. I'm not asking you to replace Sarah or pretend to feel something you don't. I'm talking about a practical arrangement, a marriage that gives legitimacy to what we're already doing, raising Hope together, running this ranch together, being a family." "That's not fair to you." "Why not? I'd have a home, security, a purpose, and Hope would have what she needs. 2 parents who love her, a stable household, a name that no one can question." Eleanor met his eyes. "It doesn't have to be complicated, Caleb. It can just be what it is. 2 people choosing to build a life together because it makes sense." But Caleb wanted to argue, wanted to say it was too soon, that he wasn't ready. But the truth was, he'd been thinking about this same thing for weeks. The awkwardness of Eleanor's undefined status, the questions from neighbors, the way Hope was growing up in a household that existed outside normal conventions. "What about love?" he asked quietly. You deserve more than just a practical arrangement. I'm 63 years old. I've had love. I've had passion and romance and all the things people write poems about. Eleanor smiled sadly. I'm not looking for that again. What I'm looking for is exactly what we have: companionship, partnership, shared purpose. That's enough. Is it? Caleb studied her face. Because that night during the storm, you said, I know what I said. Eleanor's voice was soft. And I meant it. I do love you, Caleb. And I love Hope more than I ever thought I'd love anyone again. But I also know that what we have isn't the same as what you had with Sarah. And I'm all right with that. I'm not sure I am. The admission surprised him. Eleanor, you're not just the woman who helps me raise my daughter. You're not just practical or convenient. He struggled for words. When I think about my future, you're in it. Not as an arrangement, but as a choice. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. Caleb, I'm not saying I've stopped grieving Sarah. I probably never will completely. But I'm also not going to pretend that what I feel for you is less than it is. He took her hand. If we're going to do this, if we're going to make it official, then let's do it honestly. Not as a convenient arrangement, but as two people who care about each other and are choosing to build something together. What exactly are you asking me? Caleb took a breath. This wasn't how he'd imagined this moment, sitting on the porch in his work clothes with the sound of cattle lowing in the distance. But life rarely gave you the moments you imagined. It gave you the moments you had, and it was up to you to make them matter. I'm asking you to marry me, he said simply, not because it's practical or because people are talking or because hope needs legitimacy, but because I want you to be my wife. Because I love you, Eleanor Price, and I want to spend whatever time we have building a life together. Eleanor stared at him, tears streaming freely down her face. You love me? Yes. The certainty in his own voice surprised him. I love you. Not the same way I loved Sarah, you were right about that. But just as deeply, just as truly. I never thought... Eleanor's voice broke. After losing my family, I never thought I'd have this again. A home, a husband, a child to raise. Is that a yes? She laughed through her tears. Yes, you fool. Yes, of course it's yes. Caleb pulled her into his arms, and they sat there on the porch holding each other as the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and gold. Inside, Hope made a small sound in her sleep, and they both smiled. We should tell her first, Eleanor said. When she wakes up, it seems only right. Tell a 4-month-old baby we're getting married? She's part of this too. She should know. Eleanor pulled back to look at him. This is her family we're making official. They went inside together, and Eleanor lifted Hope from her cradle. The baby blinked sleepily, then smiled when she saw both of them together. Hello, sweetheart, Eleanor said softly. We have news. Your father and I are getting married, which means I'm going to be your mother, not your first mother. You'll always have Sarah, and we'll make sure you know all about her. But I'm going to be here, loving you and raising you and telling you stories for as long as I'm able. Hope reached out and grabbed Eleanor's finger, holding tight. Then she turned her head toward Caleb and made a sound that might have been approval. I think she likes the idea, Caleb said, his voice thick with emotion. Of course she does. Eleanor kissed Hope's forehead. She's a smart girl. She knows a good deal when she hears one. They decided to get married in town at the small courthouse with just a few witnesses. Nothing fancy or elaborate. Neither of them wanted that. But when word got out, the community of Willow Bend had other ideas. Mrs. Chen appeared at the ranch 3 days before the planned wedding with a dress she'd altered to fit Eleanor. You can't get married in a work dress, she said firmly. This was mine. My mother's before that. It would be an honor if you'd wear it. Tom Chen brought his fiddle and announced he'd be providing music. The owner of the general store donated flowers from his wife's greenhouse. The minister's wife baked a cake. And suddenly, what was supposed to be a simple civil ceremony had turned into a community celebration. I didn't expect this, Eleanor said the night before the wedding, looking at the dress hanging in the bedroom. All these people we barely know, going to such trouble. They're not doing it for us, Caleb said. They're doing it for Hope, giving her the kind of beginning she deserves. A beginning, Eleanor smiled. I like that. Not an ending or a replacement. A beginning. The wedding itself was simple but perfect. Eleanor wore Mrs. Chen's dress, which fit her surprisingly well with only minor alterations. Caleb wore his best suit, the one he'd worn to marry Sarah nearly 10 years before. He'd worried it might feel wrong, wearing the same suit, but instead it felt right, honoring the past while stepping into the future. Hope was there too, held by Mrs. Chen during the ceremony. She was dressed in a white gown Eleanor had sewn herself, with tiny embroidered flowers around the collar. She stayed quiet through most of it, as if she understood the solemnity of the occasion. When the minister asked if Caleb took Eleanor to be his wife, Caleb's voice was clear and certain. "I do." And when Eleanor promised to love and honor him, she added softly, "and to love and raise his daughter as my own." They exchanged simple gold bands, nothing fancy, just solid and enduring. And when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Caleb kissed Eleanor gently, sealing the promise they were making to each other and to Hope. The celebration afterward was held at the community hall, with food brought by seemingly everyone in town. Tom Chen played his fiddle while couples danced. Children ran between the tables. And in the middle of it all, Caleb and Eleanor stood together holding Hope, surrounded by a community that had adopted them as their own. "Happy?" Caleb asked Eleanor quietly. "Happier than I ever thought I'd be again," she admitted. She looked down at Hope, who was watching the dancing with wide, fascinated eyes. "We're a family now. Official and everything. We were a family before." "I know, but this makes it real in a way that matters." Eleanor looked up at him. "Thank you, Caleb, for taking a chance on a bossy old woman who showed up uninvited on your doorstep." "Thank you for staying," he replied, "for seeing what I couldn't see, for loving us when we needed it most." They danced later with Hope between them, moving in slow circles while Tom Chen played a waltz. Hope seemed delighted by the movement, making sounds that might have been laughter, and Caleb felt something he hadn't felt in nearly a year, complete joy, uncomplicated by grief or fear. That night, after the celebration ended and they returned home, Eleanor put Hope to bed while Caleb built up the fire. The house felt different now, warmer somehow, more alive. When Eleanor came downstairs, she paused in the doorway, and Caleb saw nervousness flash across her face. "This is strange, isn't it?" she said, "being married, after everything." "A little," Caleb admitted, "but good strange." They sat together on the sofa, not quite touching, both unsure how to navigate this new dynamic. They'd been living together for months, but this was different. This was official, permanent, a commitment that changed everything. "I don't expect," Eleanor started. "I know," Caleb interrupted gently. "We'll figure it out. Together. There's no rush." Eleanor relaxed slightly. "Thank you for understanding. I just need time." "I know. So do I." He reached out and took her hand. "We'll take it as it comes. One day at a time." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire, and Caleb felt a peace he hadn't known in a long time. This wasn't the life he'd planned. It wasn't the future he'd imagined with Sarah. But it was good, real, built on honesty and choice and love that had grown slowly in the spaces grief had carved out. The seasons turned. Spring gave way to summer, and the ranch flourished under their combined care. Eleanor's garden produced vegetables in abundance, more than they could use, so they sold the surplus in town. Caleb repaired the outbuildings and bought new cattle, slowly building the herd back up. And Hope grew, reaching milestones that filled them both with pride and wonder. She learned to roll over, then to sit up. She babbled constantly, strings of sounds that almost seemed like words. She recognized both of them now, smiling and reaching when they came near. And she was curious about everything, touching, tasting, exploring her world with fearless enthusiasm. "She's going to be trouble," Eleanor said one evening, watching Hope grab at everything within reach. "Look at that determination." "She gets it from her mother," Caleb said without thinking. Eleanor looked at him, surprised. "Which one?" "Both," Caleb smiled. "Sarah's stubbornness and your practicality. Poor child doesn't stand a chance of being meek." "Good," Eleanor kissed Hope's head. "The world doesn't need meek women. It needs strong ones." As the months passed, Caleb and Eleanor's relationship deepened in ways that surprised them both. They'd started as strangers thrust together by necessity, evolved into partners caring for a child, and now were slowly becoming something more. Not the passionate romance of youth, neither of them wanted or expected that, but something quieter and deeper. Companionship that felt like coming home. They shared a bedroom now, though it had taken weeks to reach that point. The first night Eleanor had moved her things into what had been Caleb and Sarah's room, she'd paused at the door. "Are you sure?" she'd asked. "I can stay in the spare room if—" "I'm sure." Caleb had already removed Sarah's things, storing them carefully in a trunk for Hope when she was older. "This is our room now, yours and mine." It was different, sharing his bed with Eleanor. She was practical even in sleep, taking up exactly her half of the bed, her breathing steady and even. But over time, Caleb found himself grateful for her presence, the warmth of another person beside him, the comfort of not being alone in the dark. And sometimes, when nightmares woke him, dreams of losing Sarah or Hope or both, Eleanor would sense his distress and reach for his hand, holding it until he calmed. She never asked about the dreams, never pushed him to talk. She just held his hand and let him know he wasn't alone. By the time Hope was 8 months old, Caleb realized he couldn't remember the last time he'd thought of Eleanor as the matchmaker or the temporary help. She was simply Eleanor, his wife, Hope's mother. The person who knew him better than anyone, who could read his moods with a glance, who anticipated what he needed before he knew himself. It was Eleanor who suggested they visit Sarah's grave together, all three of them. They went on a clear autumn day when the leaves were turning gold and the air smelled of wood smoke and earth. Hope sat between them on the blanket Eleanor had spread beside the headstone, playing with her toes and babbling nonsense. Caleb hadn't been back since the funeral. He'd been avoiding it, afraid of the grief it would unleash. But Eleanor had been right to insist they come. It was time to face it, to acknowledge what had been lost while celebrating what remained. "Hello, Sarah," Eleanor said quietly, addressing the headstone as if Sarah could hear her. "I hope you don't mind my being here. I've been taking care of your family, your husband and your daughter, trying to do right by them, the way you would have wanted." Caleb felt his throat tighten. He reached down and picked up Hope, holding her so she could see the headstone, though of course she was too young to understand. "This is your mother," he told Hope softly. "Your first mother, Sarah. She loved you before you were even born. She wanted you so badly, and she would have been so proud of who you're becoming." Hope grabbed at his face, her tiny fingers exploring his beard. She made a sound that was almost a word, and Caleb felt tears slip down his cheeks. "I'm sorry I couldn't save you," he said to Sarah. "I'm sorry you don't get to see her grow up. She has your eyes, you know, and I think she's going to have your laugh, that surprised, delighted sound you used to make." He paused. "I miss you. I'll always miss you. But Sarah, I'm not alone anymore. She's been everything, and I hope, you'd be glad about that." Eleanor's hand found his, squeezed gently. They sat there together beside Sarah's grave, with Hope between them, and Caleb felt something shift. Not closure exactly, he wasn't sure grief ever truly closed, but acceptance. Sarah was gone. That loss would always be part of him. But his life wasn't over. He had hope. He had Eleanor. He had a future worth building. As they prepared to leave, Caleb noticed Eleanor had placed a small bouquet of flowers on the grave, wildflowers from the ranch, the kind Sarah had loved. "Thank you," he said quietly. "She deserves to be remembered," Eleanor replied. "By all of us." Winter came again, and this time Caleb faced it with confidence rather than dread. The ranch was ready, supplies stocked, animals sheltered, the house winterized. When the first snow fell, he and Eleanor sat together by the fire, while Hope played on a blanket at their feet, and Caleb marveled at how different this winter was from the last. A year ago, he'd been drowning, broken by grief, overwhelmed by responsibility, certain he was going to fail at everything. Now he was married to a woman he loved, raising a daughter who was thriving, managing a ranch that was prospering. It felt impossible that so much could have changed in such a short time. "What are you thinking about?" Eleanor asked, noticing his expression. "About how lost I was a year ago. About how you saved us." "We saved each other," Eleanor corrected. She reached over and took his hand. I was just as lost as you were, Caleb, just better at hiding it. Coming here, being needed, having a purpose again, it saved me too. Hope made an emphatic sound, as if disagreeing with the whole conversation. She'd pulled herself up on the edge of the sofa and was standing there shakily, proud of her accomplishment. Look at her, Eleanor said, delighted. She's going to be walking soon. And then running, and then we'll never keep up with her. Caleb scooped Hope up, making her squeal with laughter. You're going to be trouble, aren't you? Hope grabbed his nose and babbled something that sounded remarkably like agreement. That evening, after Hope was asleep and they were preparing for bed, Eleanor paused in front of the mirror. Do you ever regret it? She asked quietly. Marrying me instead of someone younger? Someone who could give you more children? Caleb came to stand behind her, meeting her eyes in the mirror. Never. Not for a moment. But you could have. I have exactly what I need. He turned her to face him. Eleanor, you gave me back my life. You taught me how to be a father. You made this house a home again. You love my daughter like she's your own. What more could I possibly want? I'm old, Caleb. In 10 years, 15, in 10 years, you'll still be Eleanor, still the woman I chose, still the person I want beside me. He kissed her forehead. Age doesn't change what matters, and what matters is us, this family we've built. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. I love you. I don't know when it happened or how, but I love you so much it frightens me. I love you too. Caleb pulled her close. And I'm not frightened anymore. For the first time in over a year, I'm not afraid of what comes next. They stood there holding each other, and through the door they could hear Hope's steady breathing, their daughter, their family, their future. Spring returned, bringing with it Hope's first birthday. Eleanor insisted on making a cake, even though Hope wouldn't eat much of it. The Chens came over, along with several other families from town, and they celebrated in the ranch house that had once been filled with grief, but was now filled with life. Hope smashed her cake with enthusiastic abandon, getting frosting everywhere and laughing with pure delight. She was walking now, toddling from person to person with unsteady but determined steps. And when she fell, she'd simply sit down hard and then pull herself back up, refusing to be discouraged. She's fearless, Mrs. Chen observed, just like her mother. Both her mothers, Tom Chen added, looking at Eleanor with approval. After everyone left, Caleb and Eleanor gave Hope her bath, washing frosting out of her hair while she splashed and played. Then Eleanor dressed her in a nightgown and carried her to the rocking chair. Story time, Eleanor said, settling Hope on her lap. Let me tell you about a little girl who was born in the midst of winter, when everything seemed dark and cold and impossible. But she was strong, this little girl. She fought and grew and filled her house with light. Caleb listened from the doorway, watching his wife tell his daughter a story that was really Hope's own story, just disguised enough to be magical. And he felt a gratitude so profound it was almost painful. A year ago, he'd been certain his life was over, that nothing good could ever come from the ashes of what he'd lost. But he'd been wrong. Life had found a way to continue, to grow, to become something new and unexpected and beautiful. Sarah would always be part of them, in Hope's eyes, in the stories they told, in the love that had created her. But Eleanor was part of them too now, woven into their family in ways that felt permanent and right. After Hope fell asleep, Eleanor carried her upstairs and tucked her into her crib. She stood there for a moment, watching Hope sleep, and Caleb came to stand beside her. Thank you, he said quietly. For what? For not giving up on us. For staying when it would have been easier to leave. For loving us, even when we were both too broken to know what we needed. Eleanor leaned against him. I didn't stay in spite of the brokenness, Caleb. I stayed because of it, because I understood it, because I needed you both as much as you needed me. They stood together in the nursery, watching Hope sleep, and outside the window the Montana spring was painting the world green. The ranch was thriving, the cattle were healthy, the garden was full of life. And inside this house, there was love, complicated and hard-won and absolutely real. Tell me the end of the story, Caleb said softly. The one about the little girl born in winter. Eleanor smiled. The end? Oh, there's no end yet. She's only 1 year old. Her story is just beginning. Then tell me what comes next. What comes next is life, Eleanor said simply. Years and years of it. She'll grow up strong and stubborn and brave. She'll learn about her first mother and love her second mother. She'll ride horses across these hills and plant flowers in the garden and fill this house with laughter. And when she's grown, she'll tell her own children about the winter she was born and how two broken people found each other and built something beautiful from the pieces. That's a good ending. It's not an ending. It's a beginning. Eleanor turned to look at him. That's what we are, Caleb. Not an ending, but a beginning. All three of us together. Caleb kissed her then, soft and sure, and in the crib, Hope sighed in her sleep. Outside, the wind moved through the grass and the stars wheeled overhead, and the ranch settled into night. And inside this house that had once been filled with grief, there was light and warmth and the sound of a family breathing together. They'd survived the darkness. They'd chosen each other. And now, finally, they were ready for whatever came next. Not as individuals struggling alone, but as a family, bound by love and choice and the simple courage of staying. The matchmaker had come to find a wife for a widowed rancher. Instead, she'd found a home, a purpose, a daughter to raise and a man to love. She'd found everything she'd thought she'd lost 40 years ago when her own family died. And the rancher, drowning in grief and fear, had found someone who saw his brokenness and didn't walk away. Someone who taught him that love didn't replace love. It just made room for more. That healing wasn't about forgetting, but about learning to carry loss alongside joy. Together, they'd built something neither of them had planned, but both of them needed. Not a perfect family, there was no such thing, but a real one. Honest and messy and absolutely worth every moment of fear it had taken to create. Hope stirred in her crib, made a small sound, then settled back into sleep. And Caleb and Eleanor stood together in the doorway, watching over her, ready for whatever tomorrow would bring. The story that had begun with a baby's cry and a matchmaker's arrival had become something neither of them could have imagined. It had become home. It had become family. It had become hope in every sense of the word. And that, finally, was enough.